She had been awake for 19 hours straight, her hand still carrying the memory of another person's blood, when the man raised his fist at her. And nobody in that hallway moved. Not one person. 30 years old, running a billion-dollar medical company through the worst crisis of her career. And Victoria Hale stood there alone while a room full of people chose silence over decency. But someone in the back of that crowd hadn't made that choice yet. Someone was already moving. What happened in that hospital corridor in the next 4 minutes would unravel 20 years of secrets, destroy one of the most powerful families in the city, and change both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. If you've ever watched someone do the right thing when everything was working against them, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The accident report came through at 11:47 p.m. Victoria was in her office on the 14th floor of Hale Medical Center when the call hit her desk. Not through the normal channels, not through her assistant or the night operations coordinator, but directly to her personal line, which meant someone downstairs had already decided this was above their pay grade. She picked up on the second ring. "Talk to me," she said. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Priya Nair, the attending physician on duty in the emergency department. Priya was not someone who panicked easily. She had been working trauma medicine for 11 years and had seen things that would make most people quit the profession entirely. The fact that her voice carried a thin edge of something close to controlled fear told Victoria everything she needed to know about what was coming. "Multi-vehicle on the interstate," Priya said. 6 cars. Fire still on scene. We've got 4 incoming, 2 critical. One of the criticals is a minor, 15 years old, blunt chest trauma, possible internal bleeding, dropping pressure. She's going to need a surgical team ready the moment that ambulance pulls in. Who's on call for cardiothoracic tonight? Dr. Ellison was, but he went home sick 2 hours ago. His backup isn't answering. Victoria was already standing, already reaching for her jacket. What about Ramos? She's in surgery, has been for 6 hours. Then get me someone from General who can assist and pull up every set of hands we've got. I'll be down in 4 minutes. She paused at the door. How old did you say she was? 15. Victoria hung up and took the stairs. The emergency department at Hale Medical Center was not a quiet place under normal circumstances. It was a level 2 trauma center serving a city of 400,000 people, attached to a medical complex that Victoria's grandfather had built from the ground up in the 1970s and that her father had expanded into something considerably more complicated than her grandfather had ever intended. On a good night, the ED saw 140 patients. On a bad night, it saw nearly double that. This was not a good night. By the time Victoria pushed through the double doors from the stairwell, the department had already shifted into the particular kind of controlled movement that trauma calls produced. Nurses pulling carts, residents moving equipment, the sound of radios and overhead pages cutting through the low hum of the facility's ventilation system. She clocked Priya immediately, standing near the trauma bay with a tablet in her hand, and her expression locked into the careful neutrality that doctors wear when they're managing something serious and don't want to alarm anyone around them. Update, Victoria said, falling into step beside her. ETA 6 minutes. Her name is Sophie Aldrich. Parents are already in the family waiting area. They were in a second vehicle, minor injuries. She was a passenger in the first car. Priya pulled up the incoming vitals on her tablet. BP was 78/50 when they loaded her. Paramedics have 2 lines in, pushing fluids, but she's not stabilizing the way they'd like. What do we have for surgical backup? Dr. Okonkwo is scrubbing in. He's general surgery, not cardiothoracic, but he's the best we've got right now. He trained under Merchant at Johns Hopkins. He knows what he's doing. That'll have to be enough. Victoria scanned the trauma bay, checking the setup the way she always did, looking for anything out of place, any gap in the preparation. She'd learned that habit from her father, back when she used to trail him through the same department as a child, watching the way he moved through a crisis, calm and deliberate, missing nothing. It was probably the most useful thing he'd ever taught her, and she hated that she still relied on it. She saw the portable ultrasound machine in the corner and nodded. Get that positioned closer. If we're dealing with a hemothorax, I want imaging before she even hits the table. A technician moved without being told twice. Sophie Aldrich arrived at 12:03 a.m. She was small. That was the first thing Victoria noticed, which was a strange thing to notice given everything else happening. Small and pale and very still in the way that people became still when their bodies were using everything available just to keep going. The paramedics were talking fast, handing off information in the clipped, efficient shorthand of people who'd done this hundreds of times. And Victoria was listening and absorbing and simultaneously watching Priya's hands move over the girl's chest, checking, assessing. Breath sounds are decreased on the right, Priya said. Tension, pneumo, or hemothorax. Could be both. Let's confirm. The ultrasound took 40 seconds. The image was unambiguous. Hemothorax, the technician said. Significant. Victoria leaned in beside Okonkwo. Your call on approach, but I'd move now. Okonkwo was already gloved. Agreed. Let's get her intubated and into OR 3. The next 9 minutes were the kind of minutes that Victoria had trained herself not to feel during. The kind that required a complete suspension of everything except the task in front of you. She wasn't the attending physician, wasn't the surgeon, wasn't the person making the primary decisions in that room. But she was present, and she was useful, and she understood enough of the medicine to assist where assistance mattered. She handed instruments when asked. She called out vitals when Priya's attention was elsewhere. She kept her voice flat and her movements controlled, and she did not think about the parents sitting 40 meters away in a waiting room, not knowing. Sophie's blood pressure hit 62 at one point, and the room got very quiet for about 8 seconds. Then, Okonkwo made an adjustment, and it started climbing again. It was somewhere around 12:40 a.m. when the noise started in the hallway outside the trauma bay. Victoria heard it as a disruption at first, raised voices, the kind of argument that carried even through closed doors, and filed it as a problem for someone else to handle. She was focused. She was in the middle of something that mattered more than whatever was happening out there, and the emergency department had staff for exactly these situations. Except the noise didn't stop. It got louder. She heard a woman's voice, sharp with anxiety, and then a man's voice cutting over it, the particular aggressive pitch of someone who was accustomed to being heard immediately and was furious about being made to wait. She heard the word chairman used as a weapon, the way certain people used names and titles, as if the name itself was supposed to open doors. She kept her attention on Sophie. 3 minutes later, the doors opened. The nurse who came in, Reyes, a veteran of the department who had worked nights for 9 years, and who Victoria knew by name and trusted entirely, had the expression of someone delivering news they'd rather not deliver. Ms. Hale, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a situation outside. I'm aware there's a situation outside. I can hear it. He's asking for you specifically. Victoria glanced at Okonkwo, who gave a small nod. They were past the most critical window. Sophie was stabilizing. The situation was moving toward controlled. She stripped her gloves and stepped out. The man in the hallway was 26 or 27 years old, taller than average, wearing clothes that cost more than most people in that building made in a week. He had the kind of face that had probably been considered handsome before it settled into something harder and less interesting. The kind of face that came from getting everything you wanted for too many years in a row. His name, she would learn shortly, was Derek Calloway. His father was Richard Calloway, chairman of the board of Calloway Health Partners, which was the majority stakeholder in the medical complex that housed Hale Medical Center. Victoria knew who Richard Calloway was. She had been negotiating with him, arguing with him, and navigating around him for the past 3 years. She did not know Derek. Not yet. Beside him was a young woman holding her right wrist against her chest, her expression suggesting she was in genuine pain, but also deeply uncomfortable with the scene being made on her behalf. A sprained wrist, Victoria assessed, from across the hallway. Possibly fractured, though the girl was moving her fingers without apparent difficulty. Not critical. Not anywhere close to critical. Ms. Hale, Derek said, and the way he said it made her name sound like a summons. I've been waiting for 22 minutes. I know, Victoria said. I was informed. I apologize for the delay. My girlfriend needs to be seen immediately. She will be seen. The triage nurse assigned her a priority rating based on her presenting symptoms. There are patients currently. I don't care about other patients. He said it with such complete casualness that it took a moment to fully register. Not angry, exactly. Not even particularly aggressive in that moment. Just stating a fact, the way someone states that they'd prefer their coffee black. I don't care about other patients. My father funds this hospital. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understand what you're telling me, Victoria said. And I want to be very clear with you about something. There is a 15-year-old girl in that room behind me who nearly died 40 minutes ago and is still in a critical condition. I have one surgeon and 2 attending physicians managing her care. The moment we have the capacity to bring someone additional into a treatment room, your girlfriend will be moved up. That is what I can offer you. Derek looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That's not good enough." I understand your frustration. No. His voice shifted. The casualness was gone. You don't. You work for my father. This hospital exists because of my father's money. And I'm standing here telling you that I need my girlfriend seen right now, and you're giving me the same speech you'd give some random person off the street. Do you have any idea? Mr. Calloway, Victoria kept her voice level. I am not going to move a critically injured minor out of a trauma bay to make room for a patient with a non-life-threatening injury. I'm not going to do that regardless of who your father is. If you'd like to file a complaint with hospital administration, I'll give you the direct contact information myself. But that is my final answer. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Derek Calloway's right hand connected with the left side of Victoria Hale's face. It wasn't a slap. It was a strike. Backhanded, sharp, the kind of impact that sent a bright flash of pain through her jaw and cheek and snapped her head to the side. She stumbled against the wall, one hand going out to catch herself, and for a moment the hallway was absolutely frozen. 6 employees in her immediate line of sight, every one of them completely still. The young woman beside Derek had gone pale and pulled away from him, her injured wrist forgotten, her eyes wide with something between shock and recognition. Like this wasn't entirely new behavior, but this was further than it had gone before. Victoria straightened slowly. Her cheek was already throbbing. She could feel the heat of it spreading up toward her eye socket. She looked at Derek Calloway with the steadiest gaze she could manage and said, in a voice that she was working hard to keep from shaking, "You need to leave this floor." "Or what?" he said. "You'll call the board? Go ahead. Tell them what you told me. See what happens to your contract." He took a step toward her. The man who stepped out from near the nurse's station had not been there a moment ago, or if he had been, he'd been the kind of still that made people stop noticing him. He was tall, not the aggressive, performed tallness of someone like Derek who wore his height like authority, but the functional tallness of someone whose body had been shaped by years of practical use. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a dark jacket, a visitor's badge clipped to his pocket. His face was the kind of face that didn't give you a lot to read. Not cold exactly, but controlled in a way that felt genuine rather than practiced. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He moved at a pace that was somehow both unhurried and arrived immediately where it needed to be, between Derek Calloway and Victoria Hale, close enough that Derek had to take a step back without entirely deciding to. "That's enough," the man said. 3 words. No particular volume, no performance of threat. Just the plain statement of someone who had already decided how this was going to go and was giving the other party the courtesy of understanding it before anything further happened. Derek blinked. He was not someone who got "that's enough" from strangers. He was someone who got deference, apology, and rapid compliance. He didn't quite know what to do with the alternative. "Who the hell are you?" he said. "Doesn't matter," the man said. "What matters is that you just assaulted someone in a hospital hallway in front of 6 witnesses, and you're about to make a decision about what happens next. So I need you to think carefully about that decision. Get out of my way." "I'm not in your way. You're free to leave." The man didn't move an inch. "I'm just asking you to do that. Leave. Take your girlfriend to the triage desk, give them her name, and let them process her through the normal intake. That's the best option available to you right now." Something in Derek's face shifted. The rapid calculation of someone trying to decide whether the person in front of him was actually serious, whether the apparent calm was real or a bluff, whether the consequences of pushing it were worth the cost. He looked at the man's hands. They were loose at his sides, relaxed, not raised. That didn't make them less dangerous. That was, in fact, what made them more dangerous. "You have no idea who I am," Derek said. "I do, actually," the man said. "I heard you say it, and it doesn't change anything I just told you." 10 seconds of silence. Then Derek Calloway took a step back. It wasn't a retreat, he acknowledged. He dressed it up as a choice, a conscious withdrawal, something he'd decided on rather than something that had happened to him. He said something under his breath that Victoria didn't catch, and probably didn't need to. He turned to his girlfriend and said, "Come on!" and she followed him without looking back. The hallway resumed breathing. Checked. The man turned to Victoria. Up close, she could see he was somewhere in his early 30s. There was something around his eyes that had nothing to do with age. The particular quality of attention that came from spending years in environments where inattention had consequences. He looked at her face, specifically at her cheek, which she suspected was starting to show, and his expression shifted briefly into something direct and practical. "You should have that looked at," he said. "I'm fine," she said. Then, because it was true and because she was old enough to understand when a sentence needed finishing, "Thank you." "You're welcome. You're not staff here." "No, my daughter was brought in a couple hours ago. Asthma attack. She's fine. They've got her stable. I was just—" He glanced back toward a room further down the hall. "I heard the argument." Victoria's cheek was throbbing steadily now, and she was simultaneously aware that she needed to get back into the trauma bay and check on Sophie, that she needed to document what had just happened before the evening got any further along, and that she was standing in a hospital hallway at 1 a.m. having a conversation with a stranger who had just done something that none of her employees had been willing to do. "What's your name?" she asked. "Mason Ryder." "I'm Victoria Hale." She paused. "I run this facility." Something passed across his face, a recalibration, a slight reassessment. "I know," he said. "He said your name." "He did." She exhaled slowly. "Mason Ryder, former military." He didn't seem surprised by the question. "Navy. I've been out for about 2 years." "What branch?" A brief pause. "SEAL teams." She nodded. That explained the quality of stillness. That explained quite a few things. "I need to go back in," she said. "But I'd like to talk to you again before you leave tonight." "I'll be here for a while," he said. "Lily's going to be on a nebulizer for another hour at least." "Lily is your daughter?" "She's 8. He said it the way parents said their children's ages, as a piece of information that was also somehow a complete portrait. Victoria looked at him for another moment. There was something she wanted to ask, some version of "why did you step in?" But this didn't seem like the right time or the right place for that question, and she had learned over the years to put questions on hold when she didn't have the bandwidth to hear the answers properly. "I'll find you," she said, and went back through the doors. Sophie Aldrich's blood pressure was holding at 91/60 when Victoria returned, which was not good but was considerably better than 62. And Okonkwo had the look of a surgeon who had passed the worst of a difficult surgery and could see the other side. Priya was managing the monitors, her movements efficient and calm, and the 3 nurses working the trauma bay had settled into the focused rhythm of people doing complicated work they knew how to do. "How is she?" Victoria asked. "Stable," Okonkwo said. He didn't look up. "She lost more blood than I'd like, and we'll need to monitor for complications through the night, but I think she's going to be okay." "I think she's going to be okay." In most contexts, that sentence carried its own uncertainty. In this one, after the last 90 minutes, it sounded like a promise. Her parents? "Priya's going to talk to them as soon as we've got her settled." Victoria stood at the edge of the trauma bay and let herself breathe for a moment, a real breath, the kind she hadn't been able to take since her phone rang at 11:47. Sophie's parents were 40 meters away, not knowing. They'd come in with their own minor injuries, which meant they'd been in another vehicle, which meant they'd been close enough to watch their daughter's accident from the outside. That was its own kind of damage, the kind that medicine couldn't measure. She looked at her reflection in the dark window of the equipment cabinet across the room. Her left cheek was swollen and darkening along the edge of her jaw. She had been struck in a public space in her own facility by the son of the man who held the controlling vote on her board, and not one person who had watched it happen had moved. She thought about that. She didn't linger on it. There wasn't time, but she thought about it. At 2:15 in the morning, she found Mason Ryder in the pediatric corridor, sitting in a chair outside room 114 with a paper cup of terrible vending machine coffee and a look of someone who had been awake for a long time and had made peace with it. Through the window, Victoria could see a small girl in a hospital bed, propped up against two pillows, connected to a pulse oximeter and a nebulizer, watching something on a tablet with the complete absorption of a child for whom the medical equipment had already become background noise. "She looks like she's handling it well," Victoria said. Mason glanced through the window and something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "She handles everything well," he said. "She gets it from her mother." There was a weight behind those words that Victoria didn't press. She pulled up the chair beside him. There were two, the standard pediatric ward provision for parents, and sat down. Her feet hurt. Her face hurt. She was running on a combination of cold coffee and the particular biochemical alertness that serious emergencies produced, the kind that would crash hard in about 4 hours. "The girl from the accident," Mason said. It wasn't a question. "She's stable. I think she's going to be okay." He nodded. Then, "Your face." "I know. You should let someone look at that properly." "I will, later." She turned toward him. "I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer it." "Okay. You've been in situations more dangerous than a hospital hallway argument. You've had every reason to keep your head down, not get involved with something that has nothing to do with you, not make an enemy out of someone you've never met. Why did you step in?" Mason thought about this for a moment. Not the quick, deflecting answer she might have expected. It was the right thing to do. Anyone would have done it. But a genuine, considered pause. "I've been in places," he said slowly, "where everyone around me decided not to see something. And I've watched what happens afterward, when that choice multiplies. One person decides not to see it, then another, and pretty soon you've got a whole room of people who've trained themselves not to notice things they should be stopping." He turned the paper cup in his hands. "I don't do that anymore." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Anymore," she repeated. He looked at her. "I wasn't always this sure about it," he said. "Used to be I could talk myself into staying out of things. Had good reasons. The mission, the team, keeping a low profile. There were things I saw and didn't act on because the tactical calculation didn't support it, and I've had to live with what happened after. So," he shrugged. Not dismissively, but with the specific weight of someone who has simplified a complicated thing because the full version would take too long. "Here." Victoria looked at her hands. "He's going to file a complaint," she said. "Maybe with the board. Maybe directly with his father. Richard Calloway has been looking for a reason to replace me for 18 months. This might be what he uses." "Even though his son assaulted you?" "He'll reframe it. He's good at that." She paused. "He's very good at a lot of things that aren't medicine." Something shifted in Mason's expression. Not alarm exactly, but the alertness of someone who has just recognized a specific type of problem. "What does that mean?" Victoria considered how to answer that. She had been carrying pieces of a much larger concern for months. Not certainty, not proof, just the accumulation of small wrongnesses that a person who ran a medical facility learned to recognize. The supply numbers that never quite added up. The patient outcomes in two specific wards that sat in a statistical range that made her uncomfortable. The way certain records requests got rerouted before they reached her desk. The 3 employees who had asked for meetings with her in the past year, and then, within a few days of each request, suddenly decided they didn't need the meeting after all. She hadn't talked about any of this to anyone. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true in the sense that she didn't have the whole picture, and not entirely true in the sense that she had strong ideas about the shape of it. Mason set his coffee down. Through the window, Lily had fallen asleep with her tablet resting on her chest, the screen still glowing. He watched her for a moment, and Victoria watched him watch her. And there was something about that, the straightforward visibility of how much he loved his daughter, that made her trust him slightly more than she had 30 seconds ago. "You've got something going on inside this hospital," he said, "beyond what happened tonight." "I think so. And Calloway's connected to it." "I think so." He turned to look at her directly. "Are you safe?" The question was so plain and so direct that it stopped her for a second. Not "are you worried" or "do you have concerns" or the various softened versions of the same inquiry that people used when they wanted to ask about danger without committing to the word. Just, "Are you safe?" "I don't know," she said. He nodded like that was the honest answer he'd expected. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "Okay." You should tell me what you know. Victoria looked at him. She had run this company for 3 years. She had navigated board politics and regulatory reviews and 2 separate rounds of contract renegotiation and 1 attempted hostile acquisition, and she had done all of it with a small circle of advisors and a tight grip on what she disclosed and to whom. She did not talk to strangers. She also did not, as a rule, have strangers step between her and a violent confrontation in a hospital hallway and then tell her they weren't interested in what happened next. "You don't work here," she said. "You don't have any connection to this situation. You have a daughter in room 114 who needs to be discharged in the morning." "That's all true," he said. "So why would you want to get involved in something that could go sideways in a lot of directions very quickly?" Mason thought about it. Not long. He'd clearly been thinking about it since the hallway. "Because you're already in it," he said, "and you don't have anyone watching your back." He paused. "Do you?" The honesty of that question sat in the air. No, she didn't. She had lawyers and administrators and a board that was currently more liability than asset, and she had employees who had gone silent when a man struck her in their presence. She had her own determination, which was considerable, and she had 18 months of instinct about something rotten inside the institution she was responsible for. She did not have someone watching her back. "No," she said. "Then let me hear what you know," Mason said, "and we'll figure out what the next step is." Victoria Hale sat in a plastic chair in a pediatric corridor at 2:20 in the morning, her face swollen and her hands still, and looked at this man she'd known for roughly an hour, this former Navy SEAL with his vending machine coffee and his sleeping daughter and his complete, unperformed composure, and thought about what it cost to trust someone and what it cost not to. She started talking. She told him about the supply chain anomalies she'd found in the third quarter audit, the numbers in 2 specific procurement categories that didn't reconcile with the delivery records. She told him about the patient outcomes, the cluster in Ward 7, the cluster in the overnight care unit, the mortality figures that were within technical parameters, but that made her stomach wrong every time she looked at them. She told him about the 3 employees who had approached her and then disappeared back into silence. She told him about a records request she'd filed 6 months ago with the Internal Compliance Office that had come back clean in a way that felt too clean, too fast, too complete. She told him that she'd been trying to find a way to look at all of this from outside the system, because every attempt to look at it from inside the system got rerouted. Mason listened. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 specific questions, both of them about the supply chain numbers, specific and technical questions that suggested he understood procurement systems better than most civilian contexts would explain. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. "How long has Callaway had majority board control, Singh?" he asked. "He consolidated it about 4 years ago. I inherited this position from the previous CEO, who retired 18 months after Callaway got full control. The timing never sat right with me." 18 months, Mason said. "That's a window. Long enough for someone to feel settled, short enough that a new CEO would still be looking at everything fresh." "Which is exactly what I was doing when the first anomalies showed up." He nodded slowly. "You need to find one person inside the building who knows something specific and has been afraid to say it." "I've been trying." "I know, but you've been trying as the CEO, which means everyone who might talk to you is also afraid of what happens to them after." He paused. "You need someone who isn't in the chain of command, someone they don't have leverage over." He looked at her steadily. "That's easier from the outside." Victoria studied him. "You're serious?" "What?" "I've spent 12 years in environments where institutional corruption killed people," Mason said, and there was nothing dramatic in the way he said it, nothing performed, just the flat weight of it. "It looks like this, it starts like this, and it doesn't stop by itself." Through the window, Lily shifted in her sleep, and the tablet slid off her chest onto the mattress. Neither of them moved. "What would you need?" Victoria asked. "Access to the records you can get me without triggering flags. The names of the 3 employees who came to you, whatever documentation you have on the supply chain numbers." He paused. "And time. This kind of thing doesn't crack in a week." "I don't know if we have more than a week," she said. "If Callaway goes to his father after tonight, then we start tomorrow," Mason said. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her grandfather, who had built this building with the stated intention that it would always put patients first. She thought about Sophie Aldrich, 15 years old, stabilizing in Trauma Bay 1, with parents sitting in a waiting room who would get their good news in about 40 minutes if Priya's timing was right. She thought about the mortality figures that sat in her head like a splinter she couldn't reach. She thought about a hallway full of people who had chosen not to move. "Tomorrow," she said. Mason nodded. He picked up his paper cup, realized it was empty, and set it back down. "Your face," he said again. "I know," she said. "You're going to need to document it tonight. Photos, written statement, the whole thing. Everything that happened in that hallway. Every witness you can identify." "I know how to document things." "I know you do." He said it without condescension, just acknowledgement. "I'm just saying don't wait on it. Whatever story he's constructing right now, you want yours already on record." She stood up. Her feet still hurt. The emergency alertness was still running, but it was thinner now, burning lower, and she could feel the exhaustion underneath it waiting to take over the moment she let it. "Mason," she said. He looked up. "Why did you really step in?" Not the philosophical answer, the real one. He thought about it. Actually thought about it, not performing consideration, but having it, and she watched the thing that moved across his face, something complicated and specific, not quite pain, but in that territory. "Lily's mother died 18 months ago," he said. "Car accident. Nothing dramatic. Just a regular Tuesday, and then she wasn't there anymore." He looked at his hands, and I've thought about it a lot since then. The moments just before things happen, the moments where someone could step in and doesn't. The driver who was on his phone, the maintenance crew that filed a report about that intersection 2 months earlier and got told it wasn't a priority. All the small places where someone decided it wasn't their problem. He paused. "I can't fix any of that, but I can decide that when I'm standing right there, in the moment, with the option in front of me, I'm not going to be one of those people." Victoria stood in the corridor and let that settle. "I'll find you in the morning," she said. "I'll be here." She walked back toward the elevator, her footsteps quiet on the polished floor, the building humming around her in its late-night register. She passed 2 nurses at the station who nodded at her with the careful neutrality of people who had heard what happened and were waiting to see what it meant. She passed the door of the trauma bay where Sophie Aldrich was sleeping through her own survival. She pressed the button for the elevator, and while she waited, she took out her phone and opened the camera. She took 3 photos of her face, systematic and clinical, the way you documented damage. Then she started writing the statement. The statement took 40 minutes to write. Victoria sat in her office on the 14th floor with the door locked and the overhead lights on full. The harsh, functional lighting that made the room look like what it was, a workspace rather than anything warmer. And she typed out everything she remembered with the precision of someone who understood that memory degraded and details mattered, and that the version of events she put down tonight would be the one she'd have to stand behind later. She included the timeline. She included Derek's exact words, the ones she could recall verbatim, and approximations of the ones she couldn't. She included the names of the 6 employees she'd identified in the hallway, the ones who had been present and had not moved. She did not include Mason Ryder by name in the initial document. Not because she was hiding him, she would add him later, in a supplementary statement, but because she needed to think carefully about what his involvement meant and how to characterize it without creating complications she couldn't anticipate yet. She sent the document to her personal attorney at 3:07 a.m. with a note that read, "Retain this. Do not discuss with anyone connected to the Callaway board. I'll call you at 8. Then she went to the hospital's internal security office and spent 20 minutes with the overnight supervisor pulling the hallway camera footage and having it copied to 2 separate drives, one for herself and one that she sealed in an envelope and logged into the facility's legal hold system. The security supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald who had worked nights at Hale for 11 years, watched the footage on the monitor without saying anything for a long moment. "You want me to flag this for the morning shift supervisor?" he asked. "Flag it as a security incident requiring administrative review," Victoria said. "Don't discuss the specifics with anyone until I've spoken to legal." Gerald nodded slowly. "Your face," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm handling it." She went back upstairs and sat at her desk and didn't sleep. Mason was discharged with Lily at 6:40 in the morning. Lily was 5 pounds of opinion and apparently very clear on how she felt about hospital food, the scratchy texture of the pediatric ward blankets, and the fact that her father had forgotten to bring her specific water bottle, not just any water bottle, the purple one with the penguin on it, which was apparently non-negotiable. "I told you," she said for approximately the third time since waking up, as Mason helped her into her jacket. "You did tell me," he agreed. "The penguin one doesn't leak." "I know. The other ones leak." "Lily." He crouched down to her level and zipped her jacket up to the second-to-last notch, the way she liked it. "I need you to be patient for about 15 more minutes, and then we're going home and you can have the penguin bottle, and I'll make you actual breakfast instead of hospital eggs. Deal?" She considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old conducting a genuine negotiation. "What kind of breakfast?" "Whatever kind you want. Pancakes with the blueberries cooked inside, not on top." "Done. And bacon." "You're going to bankrupt me," he said, and stood up. She took his hand, which she still did without self-consciousness. That particular unself-consciousness of children who hadn't yet decided that needing people was something to be managed. And they walked together toward the elevator. Victoria was waiting near the main lobby, still in the same clothes from the night before, with 2 cups of coffee that were better than the vending machine variety. The bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight into something that was now visibly a bruise, a distinct discoloration running along her jawline that no one who looked at her could miss. She had, at some point in the past hour, made the pragmatic decision to stop trying to address it with anything because it didn't matter and she had other things to do. She looked at Lily, and her expression did the thing that adults' expressions did around children they didn't know. A slight, involuntary softening. "You must be Lily." Lily looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a child taking stock of an unfamiliar adult. "What happened to your face?" "Lily," Mason said. "Someone hit her," Lily said, with the calm diagnostic accuracy of a child raised in a household where things were named plainly. She looked at Victoria. "Did you hit them back?" "I didn't," Victoria said. Lily considered this. "My dad says you shouldn't hit people unless they hit you first." "That's a reasonable policy," Victoria said. "Did they hit you first?" "They did." Lily turned to Mason with an expression that said the rest of this conversation was now his problem. He took the coffee Victoria offered and guided Lily gently toward the lobby seating area. "Give us 5 minutes," he told his daughter. "Just sit right there. I can see you from here." Lily settled into a chair with the resigned dignity of someone who knew she was being managed and was choosing to permit it. She pulled out a small battered book from her jacket pocket and opened it with the practiced speed of a child who had learned to always have something to read. Mason turned back to Victoria. "Did you sleep?" "No. Did you?" "A little. In the chair." He looked at her cheek. "You need to see a doctor." "I work in a hospital." "That's not the same thing as seeing a doctor." "I know." She handed him the second coffee. "I need to tell you what happened after you left the hallway last night." She told him about the statement, about the security footage, about her call to her attorney. He listened the way he had listened the night before, fully, without filling the silences with his own words. "Calloway," he said when she finished. "The son. Has he done anything like this before that you know of?" "I don't know. I've never met him. His father kept him off the board's social circuit, which I thought was just the elder Calloway being territorial about the business side of things." She paused. "I'm wondering now if it was something different." "Someone who's been kept at a distance from the professional environment," Mason said slowly, "but still has full access to the name and the leverage. Yes. That's a specific kind of problem." He was quiet for a moment, working through something. "Did the girlfriend say anything before she left with him?" "Not directly to me, but one of the nurses, Reyes, she was on duty last night, told me the girl looked like she knew what was coming when his voice changed. Like she'd read that particular escalation before." Mason's jaw tightened slightly. "What's her name, the girlfriend?" "I don't know yet. She was checked in at triage under a first name only by the time I looked at the record, Jessica, possibly. But the intake wasn't completed because they left before being fully processed. I've asked admissions to see if we have anything more. If she's seen this behavior before, she's either a witness or someone who's going to disappear as fast as possible." He said it without judgment, just assessment. "Either way, we need to find her before Calloway does any cleanup." Victoria looked at him. There was something she kept noticing. The way he moved through a problem, the way he organized information and went directly to what mattered without detours through what was dramatic or emotionally satisfying. It was the opposite of how most people she dealt with operated. Most people, when confronted with a serious problem, spent considerable energy on the parts of it that made them feel things. Mason seemed to have separated feeling things about it from doing something about it into two distinct processes that ran at different times. She suspected that was both a genuine capability and something that had cost him. "I can't go at this from the CEO position," she said. "Every move I make inside this institution right now is visible. If I start pulling records or requesting access to anything Callaway adjacent, I need a reason that makes sense on paper, and any reason I give is going to get back to Richard Callaway's office within 48 hours. Then we need someone inside who can move without that visibility. That's what I was thinking last night." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I told you about the employees who approached me and then pulled back. One of them, the one I'm most concerned about, is a nurse named Carol Pfeiffer. She's been on staff for 22 years. She came to my office in February and scheduled a meeting, and then 2 days later she sent an email canceling and saying she'd been mistaken about needing to speak with me." Victoria paused. "She looked different after that. I noticed it but didn't pursue it hard enough, and I've regretted it every week since." "Which ward is she assigned to?" "Ward 7, Overnight Care Unit, which is one of the 2 wards I mentioned, the ones with the outcome numbers that concern me." Mason was still. 22 years. That means she's been there through the entire Callaway period. She's been there through 3 CEOs. She knows things. He said it not as speculation, but as a near certainty, the conclusion of a logical sequence. The question is whether she's scared of Callaway specifically or of the institution generally. "Does it matter?" "It matters for how you approach her," he said. "If she's scared of Callaway, she needs to see that someone outside his reach is involved. If she's scared of the institution, she needs to believe there's a safe channel. Those are different conversations." Victoria thought about Carol Pfeiffer, the woman's face in the hallway 2 months after the canceled meeting, the particular quality of her stillness, the way she moved through the ward with the deliberate low-profile efficiency of someone who had decided that invisibility was a survival strategy. "Both," she said. "I think it's both." Mason nodded. "Then she needs to hear from someone who isn't you," he said. "Not because you're not trustworthy, because you're visible and you're in Callaway's crosshairs, and anyone seen talking to you right now is taking a risk they might not be willing to take." "You," Victoria said, "if you trust me enough to ask me." She considered that for a moment. She had known this man for roughly 7 hours. She had watched him insert himself into a dangerous situation with no personal stake, and she had listened to him talk about his daughter and his dead wife and the places where he'd made choices he couldn't undo. And she had read in his face the specific kind of integrity that was hard to manufacture because it came from having already paid a price for the cheaper version. "I trust you enough," she said. "Yes." It took 4 days. 4 days during which Victoria ran her company with the surface calm of someone who had not just filed a police report about an assault by the board chairman's son, who was not quietly building a case against the most powerful medical stakeholder in the city, who was sleeping normally and working normally and responding to emails normally. She was good at the surface calm. She'd been practicing it her whole professional life. The police report generated less immediate response than she'd expected, which was itself a piece of information. A detective named Solis called her the morning after the incident and asked her to come in and make a formal statement, which she did, and he asked her standard questions in a careful, professional tone that told her he was taking it seriously and also that he understood exactly who Derek Callaway's father was and what that meant for the shape of the investigation. She gave him the footage from Gerald. She gave him the names of the employees who had been present. She left his office with the feeling that the process was moving, but moving through thick water. The bruise faded over those 4 days, unevenly, the way bruises did. Worse on day 2 than day 1, then slowly receding in the direction of yellow-green by day 4. She photographed it every morning, systematic and without sentiment. Her assistant, a sharp 28-year-old named Daniel, who knew more about the internal politics of the hospital than he ever let on, had said nothing about it on day 1, and then on day 2 had quietly placed a printout of Callaway Health Partners' most recent board filing on her desk without comment. She'd understood what he was telling her. He'd understood that she'd understood. From Richard Callaway himself, nothing. No call, no message, no contact through legal channels. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. Mason met Carol Pfeiffer on the 3rd day. He had a reason to be in the hospital. Lily had a follow-up appointment at 10 a.m. with the pediatric pulmonologist, a routine check after the ER visit, and the appointment ran long enough that he had an hour afterward with no particular place to be. He walked the hospital the way he'd learned to walk unfamiliar buildings, noting exits and sight lines and the patterns of movement, and he found Ward 7 without consulting a map. Carol Pfeiffer was coming off a 12-hour night shift when he caught her. She was 53, built solidly, with the kind of tiredness in her face that was structural rather than temporary, the fatigue of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped expecting to put it down. She was heading for the parking structure exit when he fell into step beside her. "Ms. Pfeiffer," he said, "my name is Mason Ryder. I'm not staff here, and I'm not connected to anyone on the board. I have a daughter who's a patient in pediatrics, and I've been talking to Victoria Hale about some concern she has about this facility." He kept his voice level and direct. "I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just asking if I can walk with you for 3 minutes." Carol Pfeiffer stopped walking and turned to look at him. Her face was a complicated document. Fear, and the kind of exhausted anger that lived just underneath fear in people who'd been frightened for a long time without being able to say so, and something else that he recognized as the particular vulnerability of someone who had been waiting for a specific conversation for months and was now terrified it had arrived. "Who sent you?" she said. "Nobody sent me. Victoria Hale told me your name. She wanted to come herself. She didn't because she thought it might make things harder for you." Carol looked down the corridor in both directions. Old habit, he recognized. The checking of sightlines that people developed when they'd been afraid of being overheard. "I have nothing to say," she said. "I know." He kept his voice even. "I've been in situations where having nothing to say was the safest option, and I'm not going to push you on that. I just want you to know that what you know isn't going to disappear by staying quiet. It's going to do something else." He paused. "There's a detective named Solis working an assault case that connects to this, and there are people working the financial side. It's going to come out. The only question is whether the people who've been afraid to speak get any credit for being the ones who helped it come out, or whether they just get caught in the aftermath." Carol Pfeiffer looked at him for a long moment. "I have a son," she said. "He's in college. His scholarship covers tuition, not living expenses. I cover living expenses." Her voice was flat and careful. "I need this job." "I understand that," Mason said. "That's a real thing, and I'm not minimizing it. Do you have any idea what would happen to me if—" "Yes," he said simply. "I have a pretty good idea. And I also know that you came to Victoria's office in February and scheduled a meeting, and then someone persuaded you not to take it. And I think you've been living with that decision since then." Carol's face shifted. Something behind it moved, not quite cracking, not yet, but the beginning of a crack in the surface of someone who had been holding a shape they'd decided on and was now not sure they could hold it anymore. "I didn't see anything," she said. "Nothing I could prove." "What did you see that you couldn't prove?" She looked away from him, down the corridor, out the window at the gray morning, back at him. "Records," she said quietly. "Patient records. I was covering a shift in the secure files unit. They were short-staffed. I was doing a favor for Denise, who needed the night off. And I was pulling charts for morning rounds, and I found entries that didn't match. Billing codes on patients who were already deceased at the time the services were supposedly rendered. Multiple patients, going back at least 4 years. She said it quickly, the way people said things they'd been not saying for a long time. The words came out faster than the control that was supposed to shape them. I wrote it down. I compared 3 charts to the billing records. The amounts were in the tens of thousands per patient. Mason kept his face neutral. How many patients? The 3 I checked. But the pattern, it was in the format, the way the entries were structured. It looked like it was the same across a lot more. I don't know how many. What happened to what you wrote down? I took pictures, she said, on my personal phone. I went home and I printed them and I put them somewhere safe. Her voice had gone very quiet. And then 2 days later, my supervisor called me into his office and told me that someone had flagged a protocol violation for my use of a personal device in the secure files unit, and that it was being documented in my file, and I understood what that meant. She swallowed. I canceled the meeting with Ms. Hale the same day. Do you still have the pictures? Yes. And the prints? Yes. Mason exhaled slowly. Ms. Pfeiffer, he said, and he took care with the next words because they mattered, and he knew they mattered. What you have is evidence of insurance fraud and falsified patient records. That's a federal offense. The people who did this are not going to stop doing it because they know you have that information. They're going to keep doing it, and they're going to keep the threat over your job as insurance that you won't talk. He looked at her steadily. You're not safe right now. You've been treating silence like a protection, but it isn't one. It's just a pause. Carol's eyes were bright. She blinked twice. She was not a woman who cried easily. He could read that in her face. But she was a woman who had been carrying this for 7 months, alone, making the calculation every morning that the risk of speaking was worse than the weight of not speaking. And she was tired of it in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with the 12-hour shift she'd just finished. What do I do? She said. First, he said, you don't do anything differently today. You go home. You sleep. You act like this conversation didn't happen. Second, tonight, you make a copy of everything you have and you put it somewhere that isn't your house. He paused. Is there someone you trust completely? Outside the hospital, no connection to the Callaway network? My sister, she lives in Columbus. Send it to your sister. Carol nodded. Third, he said, I'm going to connect you with Victoria Hale and a federal contact who can explain what whistleblower protection means in a case like this. In real terms, not general terms. Before you talk to anyone officially, you'll know exactly what you're protected from. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to be brave right now. I'm asking you to make a copy and send it to your sister. That's all. Carol looked at him for a long moment. The corridor hummed around them. Footsteps, ventilation, the distant sound of a cart being wheeled somewhere. And she looked like someone standing at a particular kind of edge, the kind where you either stepped back and kept maintaining the shape you'd built, or you stepped forward and accepted that the shape was already broken and had been for a long time. Okay, she said. Victoria was in a budget meeting she deeply did not want to be in when Mason texted her. She has documentation. Billing fraud on deceased patients. Multiple. She's going to send the copies to a safe location tonight. We need a federal contact. She read the message under the table, keeping her face neutral while the CFO talked about Q2 projections, and felt something that was a complicated mixture of relief and dread. Relief because here, finally, was something concrete. Dread because concrete things had weight, and this particular weight was going to fall on people she was responsible for. She typed back, I have someone. Former military intelligence, he's been consulting informally on the financial side. I'll connect you. The former military intelligence officer was a man named Webb, first name Stewart, though everyone who knew him used his last name, who had spent 8 years working financial crimes for the Defense Intelligence Agency before a knee injury that never fully healed had moved him into private consulting. Victoria had inherited the relationship from the previous CEO, who had brought Webb in to look at a procurement issue that turned out to be minor. She had kept the connection quietly, paying him on a private retainer that didn't run through the company's formal accounting, which had seemed paranoid at the time and now seemed like the most sensible thing she'd ever done. She called Webb from her car in the parking structure at 6:15 that evening before driving home. Tell me you have something specific, Webb said by way of greeting. Billing fraud on deceased patients, she said. Tens of thousands per patient, potentially across 4 or more years. Silence on the line for 3 seconds. How solid is the source? 22-year employee with direct access to records and physical documentation, currently scared out of her mind. That's solid, Webb said. What else do you have? Supply chain anomalies in 2 procurement categories. I have the internal audit numbers, but I haven't been able to match them against the external vendor records because that request would show up on the compliance radar. I can pull vendor records without going through your compliance office, Webb said. Give me the categories and the time range. Medical supply and equipment maintenance, January 2021 to present. Okay, she could hear him writing. The billing fraud. If it's what it sounds like, it's not just insurance fraud. If their billing insures for services rendered to deceased patients, there's a high probability they've also been falsifying cause of death documentation to support the billing timeline, which means some of those deaths may not have been natural, Victoria said. She'd known this was where the logic led. She'd been not thinking it for weeks, keeping it at the edge of consciousness where she could feel its shape without looking directly at it. Hearing Webb say it out loud, or nearly say it, moved it from the periphery to the center in a way that was irreversible. Yes, Webb said simply. That's the possibility we have to consider. Victoria sat in her car in the parking structure with the engine off and the silence sitting around her. How do we confirm it without tipping them off? She asked. I know a forensic accountant at the FBI field office. She owes me from a thing 2 years ago. I can get her ears on this without filing anything formal. Yet. Off the books, just enough to tell us if what we have is enough to take to the next level. He paused. But Victoria, if this goes where I think it's going, you need to understand what you're starting. This isn't a compliance issue you resolve with an internal audit and a board presentation. This is federal criminal territory. Once it opens, you don't control it. I know, she said, and Calloway is going to know you're behind it. He already suspects something, the assault last week. I heard about that, Webb said, and his voice carried something flat and cold. You have documentation? I have footage, a written statement, 6 witnesses, and a detective on file. Good. Keep all of it secure and duplicate it everywhere you can. He paused. Be careful for the next few weeks. I mean that practically, not dramatically. Change your routines. Don't be predictable. Webb, she said. Yeah. How bad do you think this is? He took his time answering. I think it's bad, he said. I think it's been going on for a while, and it's been going on because the people doing it were very confident it wouldn't get looked at. That kind of confidence comes from experience, which means this isn't the first time. She sat with that for a moment. Okay, she said. Let's start pulling threads. She told Mason all of it that night, over the phone, after Lily was asleep. He listened to the possibility about the patient deaths the same way he listened to everything. Steadily, without flinching, processing the information without being destabilized by the emotional weight of it. She'd noticed this about him. He could hold serious things seriously without the serious thing taking over the whole conversation. Webb's right about being careful, he said when she finished. If Richard Calloway gets a clear read on what's happening before we have enough to go federal, he has options, he has lawyers, and he has board influence, and he has a lot of practice making things disappear. I know. How are you doing? He asked. The question was direct and plain, the way his questions usually were. She thought about lying, the reflexive professional lie of fine, managing, focused on the work, and then didn't. I'm scared, she said. Not of Calloway specifically, of the scope of it. If Webb is right, if those patients died and the deaths were managed, then I've been running this facility for 3 years and people died in it, and I didn't stop it. You didn't know, Mason said. I should have known sooner. The signs were there. I didn't push hard enough early enough. Victoria. His voice was careful. You're describing what it feels like to inherit an institution that was already compromised and to find the compromised parts as fast as anyone realistically could. That's different from being responsible for it. I know the difference intellectually. I know, he said. It still feels like the same thing. That doesn't go away just because you understand the logic. She was quiet for a moment. Outside her apartment window, the city was doing what cities did at 9 p.m. Cars, light, the ambient sound of other people living their lives in parallel to hers. She'd lived alone in this apartment for 2 years, and most nights the sound of the city felt like company. Tonight, it just felt like distance. How's Lily? She asked. Good. She read for an hour after dinner and then fell asleep mid-page. Something in his voice shifted. That particular warmth that happened when he talked about his daughter, specific and unguarded. She asked about you, actually. She did? She asked if you were okay after... She said, The lady from the hospital with the hurt face. A pause. I told her you were working on it. Victoria smiled, which surprised her. It was the first time she'd smiled since the hallway. That's a reasonable summary, she said. She's a reasonable kid. He paused. She's also very perceptive, which is sometimes convenient and sometimes deeply inconvenient. She sounds like she keeps you honest. Every day, he said. Victoria looked out the window at the city lights and thought about Sophie Aldrich, who was recovering in Ward 3 and would probably be discharged by the end of the week. She thought about Carol Pfeiffer, who was home right now making copies of photographs and sending them to her sister in Columbus, doing the bravest small thing she'd done in 7 months. She thought about Webb and his FBI contact and the threads they were starting to pull. She thought about the weight of what was coming, the size of it, the mess of it, the fact that it would get worse before it got better and would probably damage people she hadn't anticipated. Mason, she said. Yeah. What you said to Lily. That I was working on it. She paused. That's the right answer. I know, he said. That's why I said it. She told him good night and sat in her quiet apartment with the city outside her window and the copy of Webb's preliminary notes on her kitchen table. And she thought about what Richard Calloway was doing right now. In his house, in his office, in whatever room a man like that occupied when the world was still arranged to his satisfaction. She picked up the notes and started reading again. There was a lot more work to do before that satisfaction held. Webb called on a Thursday morning, 11 days after their first conversation, and the flatness in his voice told Victoria before he said anything that what he'd found was worse than what they'd expected. She was in her car, parked in the hospital's executive lot, engine running, not yet ready to go inside and perform the version of herself that the building required. She'd been doing that more lately, sitting in her car for 5 or 10 minutes before walking in, using the transition time to build the surface. It wasn't something she was proud of, but it was something she was doing. Talk to me, she said. I've been through 3 years of vendor records against your internal procurement data, Webb said. The supply chain anomalies aren't anomalies, they're a system. Medical equipment billed to the facility at full market rate, delivered at reduced volume, the difference redirected through a shell company registered in Delaware that has no employees and a single signatory. He paused. The signatory is a man named Thomas Wick. He's listed in the Callaway Health Partners corporate structure as a logistics consultant. How much? Victoria asked. Across 3 years, in those 2 categories alone, approximately $4.3 million. The number sat in the air of the car. That's the supply side, Webb continued. The billing fraud on the patient records, my FBI contact ran it against the insurance claim database. She found 27 confirmed instances across 4 years. Deceased patients, services billed post-mortem, insurance payouts collected and routed through the same Delaware entity. He stopped. Total take from the insurance fraud is somewhere north of $2 million. $6 million, Victoria said. Across 2 channels. That they've confirmed so far. There may be more in categories we haven't pulled yet. He cleared his throat. And Victoria, the patient deaths. My contact flagged 11 cases where the billing timeline requires the patient to have still been alive at the time of service, but the cause of death documentation and the ward records don't reconcile. In 4 of those 11 cases, the attending physician's notes were altered. We can see the edit timestamps in the system metadata. Victoria closed her eyes. How many of those 4 could be homicide? She asked. The word came out of her mouth clinical and plain, which was the only way she could say it. We don't know. We're not there yet in the investigation, but the alterations are deliberate, and someone with system-level access made them, which means it wasn't done by a ward nurse covering a mistake. This was administrative. Richard Calloway has system-level access, Victoria said. So does his director of operations. Yes. She opened her eyes. The hospital's front entrance was visible from where she was parked. The sliding glass doors, the staff coming and going in the morning shift change, ordinary life moving at its ordinary pace. Somewhere in that building, people were doing their jobs honestly and carefully. And somewhere in the same building, for years, other people had been doing something that had no honest name. When is your contact going to file? Victoria asked. That's the thing I need to tell you, Webb said. She got word yesterday through the federal building's internal channels that Callaway Health Partners has engaged a lobbying firm with direct connections to the regional U.S. Attorney's Office. It might be coincidence, it might not be. A pause. She's accelerating the timeline. She wants to move to formal investigation within 2 weeks, but she needs the primary source documentation, Carol Pfeiffer's records, in original format, chain of custody established, before she files. I'll get them. Victoria. His voice changed slightly. You need to understand something. If Callaway's lobbying connection is anything other than coincidence, if someone has told him that an inquiry is forming, then the clock is running. He's going to move to protect himself. That might mean destroying records. It might mean other things. Other things, she repeated. People who know too much and don't have federal protection yet are vulnerable, Webb said. That includes Carol Pfeiffer. It includes you. She sat with that for a moment. Then, I'll call Mason. She told Mason that evening. He was at her kitchen table when she finished. He'd started coming to her apartment for the planning conversations. Neutral ground, somewhere the hospital's security cameras and the people who watched them couldn't log. And he was quiet for a moment after she laid out what Webb had given her. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe less, if Callaway moves first. He'll move first if he knows something is forming. Mason turned a pen in his fingers. A habit she'd noticed, something he did when he was processing. Does anyone inside the hospital know what you and Webb have been doing? No one connected to Callaway. Webb's contact, Carol, you, and Daniel. My assistant. That's the full circle. Your assistant. He's the one who put the board filing on my desk without being asked. He's been watching Callaway's movements from inside longer than I have. She paused. He's careful and he's smart, and he hasn't said a word to anyone. I trust him with my life. You might be, Mason said plainly, not dramatically, just stating the logical endpoint of the situation. I know. He set the pen down. Carol needs to come in, not to talk to me or to you. She needs to be in a room with Webb's FBI contact with her documentation and a lawyer present. That's the only thing that puts protection around her. I've been trying to get her there. She keeps asking for more time. She doesn't have more time. She just doesn't know that yet. He looked at Victoria. Can you get her to agree to a meeting this week? I can try. Don't try. Tell her what Webb told you. Not the part about the possible homicides, not yet, but the part about the lobbying firm and the accelerating timeline. Let her understand what staying quiet is actually costing her at this point. He said it without cruelty, just directness. She's been making a risk calculation. She needs updated information to make it correctly. Victoria nodded. She knew he was right. She'd been handling Carol gently because Carol was frightened and Carol had real stakes, and Victoria was genuinely aware of the cost she was asking this woman to accept. But gentle had its own cost when the clock was running. There's something else, Mason said. She looked at him. Derek Callaway. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, printed, not digital, she noticed, and set it on the table. I've been doing some background. After the assault, I wanted to know what we were dealing with. He unfolded the paper. He's been named in 2 prior incidents, one in 2019, a complaint filed by a former employee of Callaway Health Partners' marketing division, a woman who alleged workplace intimidation and threatening behavior. The complaint was filed, reviewed internally, and closed without finding. The employee left the company 3 months later with a severance agreement that included an NDA. That's not surprising, Victoria said. The second one is, he paused, 2021. A patient family member, a husband, his wife was treated at Callaway General, one of the other facilities in the network. She died during what should have been a routine procedure. He filed a wrongful death suit. During the discovery process, he received 2 phone calls from a blocked number warning him to drop the case. He documented them and included them in the suit. Mason looked at her. The suit was settled for an undisclosed amount. The calls were never traced. But the timing. One of those calls came from a cell tower 2 blocks from the Callaway Health Partners executive office. Victoria looked at the paper. Derek made threatening calls to a grieving husband. We can't prove it was Derek. But the pattern is consistent with someone who's been allowed to operate without accountability for a long time. Mason folded the paper again. He's not just a spoiled kid who lost his temper in a hospital hallway. He's been protecting the family operation in his own way for years. The kitchen was quiet. From the living room, the city outside the window made its usual ambient sounds. A distant siren, traffic, the particular hum of urban life at 8 p.m. Victoria looked at the pen Mason had set down on her table and thought about the shape of what they were dealing with, the father and the son and the machine they'd built together, and the people who'd been fed into it over years. "We need to move soon," she said. "Yes," he said. She got Carol into a meeting on Saturday. It took 2 phone calls, the first one delivering the information about the lobbying firm and the accelerating federal timeline exactly the way Mason had suggested, and the second one, 12 hours later, when Carol called back and said, in a voice scraped clean of everything except exhaustion, "Okay, tell me when and where." The meeting happened in the office of an attorney named Patricia Osai, who specialized in federal whistleblower cases, and who Webb had vouched for with the specific endorsement that she was someone who got results and didn't waste her clients' time on comfort that wasn't earned. Patricia's office was in a building 15 minutes from the hospital, neutral ground, nothing in the address that connected it to Hale Medical Center or the investigation. Carol arrived 10 minutes early, which told Victoria something about her, the particular punctuality of nervous people, the ones who arrived early because being late felt like an additional vulnerability. She was carrying a manila envelope in her work bag, and she looked like she had slept badly for 7 months, which was probably accurate. Patricia Osei was 50, efficient, and had the particular quality of legal professionals who had handled cases involving powerful defendants before, unimpressed by the power, focused on the mechanism. She shook Carol's hand and directed her to a chair and said, "I've reviewed the preliminary information. Before we look at what you brought, I want to walk you through what federal whistleblower protection means in practice, not in theory, because there's a significant gap between the two, and I want you to understand both sides of it." Carol sat with her hands folded on the envelope and listened. Victoria sat across the room and watched Carol's face as Patricia explained the legal framework, the protections that applied, the conditions those protections required, the specific risks that still existed within those conditions. She watched Carol process it the way someone processed a diagnosis, wanting it to be simpler than it was, understanding that it wasn't, deciding to accept the complexity because the alternative was worse. When Patricia finished, Carol opened the envelope. The photographs were printed on plain paper, slightly grainy from the phone camera, but legible. Billing codes, patient identifiers, dates of service. 3 sets, 3 deceased patients, services billed weeks, and in one case, 2 months after documented death dates. Carol had annotated them in careful pencil, cross-referencing the record numbers against the dates from her own memory of the shift when she'd found them. Patricia looked at them for 4 minutes without speaking. "This is sufficient to support a formal federal complaint," she said. "When combined with what Mr. Webb's contact has from the vendor records and the insurance database, this is a case." She looked at Carol. "I need original digital copies, the photographs as they exist on your phone, not printed versions. And I need to take a formal statement from you today, this afternoon if you're willing." Carol looked at the photographs on Patricia's desk. She looked at them the way people looked at things they'd been carrying alone for a long time, with the particular complicated feeling of something finally being in other people's hands. "Yes," she said. That night, Mason got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He was at home. Lily was in bed. He was reading through Webb's vendor analysis for the 3rd time, trying to find the edges of it, and an unknown number at 10:30 p.m. had a specific quality of nothing good. He answered anyway. The woman's voice on the line was quiet and careful, the way people spoke when they were concerned about being overheard. She said her name was Jessica Tran. He recognized the first name. The girlfriend, the woman who had been with Derek in the hospital hallway, the one with the injured wrist, who had never been fully processed through admissions. "How did you get this number?" he asked. "I talked to someone who knew someone who worked at the hospital. I know that sounds—" She stopped. "I've been trying to find someone to talk to for 2 weeks. I didn't know who was safe." "Talk to me," Mason said, and sat down. Jessica Tran had been with Derek Calloway for 14 months. She was 24 years old, worked in graphic design, had met Derek at a fundraiser for the hospital network. The particular irony of that detail landed without comment. She described the relationship with the careful, edited language of someone who had thought a lot about how to tell this story and was still not entirely sure how much to say. She was not physically hurt, she said, and Mason heard the specific emphasis of someone who had decided where to draw the line between what they would disclose and what they wouldn't. What she would disclose was this. In the 3 weeks since the hospital incident, Derek had been on the phone with his father every day. She hadn't heard the full content of the calls, but she'd heard fragments, the word evidence used multiple times, and the phrase before they file, and a specific reference to a woman named Pfeiffer that had made her chest go cold. "You mentioned Carol Pfeiffer by name?" Mason asked. "I'm not completely certain," Jessica said. "It might have been a different name. But it started with P and it was a woman's name, and after I heard it, he noticed I'd been in the hallway and he became very insistent that I go into the other room." The word insistent carried its own specific history in her voice. "Okay," Mason said. He kept his voice even. "Jessica, what you're telling me is important, and I need you to understand that it matters. But I also need to ask you something directly. Are you safe right now?" A pause. "I moved out 3 days ago," she said. "I'm staying with a friend. He doesn't know where." "Good." He meant it. "I need to connect you with an attorney. Her name is Patricia Osei. She handles federal cases. Everything you've told me and anything else you remember. She needs to hear it, in a protected context." He paused. "Will you do that?" Another pause, longer. "He's going to destroy it," she said. "Whatever they're trying to hide. He told his father," I heard this clearly. "He said, 'We have to do it before the end of the week.' That was 2 days ago." Mason went still. His mind ran the calculation fast and clear, the way it did when the shape of a situation became suddenly concrete. Before the end of the week meant Thursday at the latest. Probably sooner, probably Wednesday, and today was Sunday night. "Jessica," he said, "I need you to call Patricia Osei first thing tomorrow morning. Don't wait. Tell her what you told me." He paused. "Is there anything else you heard? Any specific location? Anything about where or how?" "The hospital," she said quietly. "He mentioned the record storage system. He said something about the server room specifically." Mason looked at the time on his phone. He thought about evidence held in a hospital server room, and the window closing, and the shape of everything Webb and Victoria and Carol had built over the past 2 weeks, sitting in the path of a man who had spent years making problems disappear before they became irreversible. He called Victoria. She answered on the second ring, which told him she hadn't been asleep. He told her everything Jessica had said, fast and plain, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. "If he wipes the server records," she said, "we lose the metadata on the altered patient files. The vendor records Webb pulled are external. Those survive. Carol's documentation survives. But the internal evidence of who altered those records and when, that's only in our system. Can you pull it? Tonight, before they get to it?" "I need system administrator access, and I need to do it without triggering a security log that goes to the compliance office." She paused. "Daniel has that access. He set up the current system." "Call him." "It's 11 o'clock. "Victoria." "I know." He could hear her already moving. "I know. Give me 20 minutes. She called Daniel, who answered on the third ring with the particular alertness of someone who had been sleeping lightly for weeks in anticipation of exactly this kind of call. She explained what she needed: a full export of the audit log metadata from the patient records system, the edit timestamps and user IDs for every modification made to patient files over the past 5 years, copied to a secure external location and removed from the primary system's accessible index so that a standard wipe wouldn't reach it. "How long do I have?" Daniel asked. "I don't know. Tonight, ideally." "Okay." She could hear him moving, the sound of a laptop opening. "Victoria, is this what I think it is?" "Yes," she said. A moment of silence. "I'll call you when it's done." Teat. She called Mason back at midnight. "Daniel's pulling the logs," she said. "He said 90 minutes. "Good." A pause. "There's something else we need to do." She recognized the particular quality of his voice, the one that meant he'd already run the logic through and had arrived at a conclusion that he was now presenting to her, not asking about. The server room itself, she said. If they go in physically, if they do more than a remote wipe, I need to be in that building, he said. Mason. Not doing anything, just present. If someone goes into that server room before your team can secure the logs, I need to know about it in real time. He paused. I know the building. I know the layout. I can move through it without anyone noticing. She stopped. That's a significant risk. Less risk than losing everything Daniel is pulling right now. He said it calmly. I'm not proposing to confront anyone. I'm proposing to watch and document and call Webb's FBI contact the moment anything moves. Victoria stood in her apartment with her phone against her ear and ran through the logic of it and arrived at the same place he had, which she'd known she would. Webb's contact needs to be notified tonight, she said. If Mason is in that building and something happens, she needs to be ready to move. Agreed. Can you reach her directly or does it go through Webb? Through Webb. I'll call him now. Okay. A pause. Victoria. Daniel's logs. The moment they're secure, get them to Patricia. Tonight, not tomorrow. I know. And get Carol somewhere other than her home tonight. The sentence landed. She hadn't thought it, not explicitly, but she heard it and understood it immediately. The logic of it, the way a person who understood operational risk thought through the downstream consequences. Carol Pfeiffer had given her statement. Carol Pfeiffer's name was somewhere in a phone conversation that had reached Jessica Tran's ears. Carol Pfeiffer was no longer just a frightened nurse with evidence. She was a specific loose end. I'll call her, Victoria said. She called Carol at 11:48 p.m. and said, without lengthy explanation, that she needed Carol to go stay with her sister tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight. Carol asked why, and Victoria said, because someone may know what you gave to Patricia Osei, and I need you somewhere safe until the federal process is far enough along that your safety is formally protected. The silence on Carol's end lasted 4 seconds. I'll get my keys, Carol said. Mason entered the hospital at 1:15 a.m. He used the service entrance on the north side, the one he'd identified during the 4 days he'd spent walking the building's layout, the entrance that the maintenance crew used for the overnight shift change, the one where the badge reader had a 2-second processing delay that, if you timed it against the door mechanism's release cycle, allowed for a secondary access without a clean log record. He'd noticed this purely because he noticed things like that. Old habit, not always useful, tonight useful. He moved through the basement corridor, past the maintenance areas, up the utility staircase to the 3rd floor where the records and server infrastructure for the administrative systems was housed. The hospital at 1 a.m. had its own particular character, quieter than daytime, but not actually quiet, full of the low institutional sounds of a building that never fully stopped. He passed 2 custodial staff members in the 2nd floor corridor, and they barely registered him, a man in dark clothing moving with the practiced ease of someone who knew where he was going. He found a position at the end of the administrative corridor, in the alcove beside the emergency exit, where he had a clear sightline to the server room door and the backup records storage room adjacent to it. He texted Victoria. In position. All clear so far. She replied within 30 seconds. Daniel has 60% of the logs exported. Webb notified FBI contact. She's standing by. He settled in to wait. At 1:52 a.m., the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened. 2 men came out, one he didn't recognize, heavy set, moving with the particular efficiency of someone whose job involved doing unpleasant things without requiring explanations. The other was Derek Calloway. Derek was not wearing the entitled casualness of the hospital hallway. He was wearing dark clothes and the face of someone who had been given a specific task by his father and was carrying the weight of what that meant. The fear of the man behind him more motivating than any personal conviction. He held a keycard in his right hand. His left hand carried a hard-sided case, the kind used for electronics. Mason watched them move to the server room door. He took out his phone and photographed them. Twice. The images catching Derek's face clearly in the corridor's security lighting. He sent both photographs to Victoria with a single line. It's happening now. Derek +1. Server room. Her reply came back in under a minute. FBI contact is filing emergency authorization. Webb says 20 minutes. Derek had the key card at the door. The second man was opening the case. Mason calculated 20 minutes against what could be deleted in 20 minutes and made a decision. He stepped out of the alcove. "Mr. Calloway," he said. His voice in the corridor was not loud. It didn't need to be. Derek turned at the sound of it, and the color drained from his face with the specific speed of someone seeing something they understood was wrong. "You," Derek said. "Me," Mason said. He kept his hands visible, his posture neutral. Not threatening. He had specifically calculated not threatening, because threatening ended in a physical confrontation, and a physical confrontation was not what this needed to be. "Step away from the door." The second man moved forward. Mason looked at him directly, the particular look of someone who has made an exact assessment and isn't concealing it, and the man stopped moving. Not because he was afraid exactly, because he'd read something in Mason's eyes that told him the calculation had already been done, and the result didn't favor him. "You don't work here," Derek said. His voice had found a thin edge of bravado, the kind that people reached for when real confidence wasn't available. "You have no authority." "No, I don't," Mason agreed. "But the federal agents who are going to be in this building in about 18 minutes do. And right now, you're standing in a corridor with a man holding a case of equipment outside a record server room at 2 in the morning. He let that sit for a moment. What you do in the next 60 seconds is going to determine a lot about what happens after tonight." Derek's jaw worked. He looked at the server room door. He looked at the man beside him. He looked at Mason with the frustrated, furious calculation of someone who had spent years in situations where his name was enough and was standing in front of the one context where it wasn't. "My father," he started. "Your father sent you here," Mason said. "I know. That's not going to protect you from what's coming. The only thing that helps you now is not making it worse." The man with the case looked at Derek. Derek looked at the server room door. His hand was still on the key card. Mason's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't take it out. He didn't break his attention, but he knew from the timing that it was Victoria. 12 minutes, probably. The corridor was very still. Derek Calloway lowered the key card. He took a step back from the door, and the man beside him lowered the case, and the three of them stood in the institutional quiet of the corridor in the specific, suspended tension of a moment that had not yet resolved, that was still tipping, that could still go in a direction that would require more than stillness and plain speech, and the weight of a man who had learned long ago that most confrontations ended before they began if you moved into them without hesitation and without theater. Then Derek turned and walked back toward the elevator. The second man followed. Mason stood in the corridor until the elevator closed and the sound of it descending had fully gone, and then he let his breath out slowly and took out his phone. Victoria had sent 3 messages in rapid succession. "FBI contact has authorization. ETA, 14 minutes. Are you okay?" He typed back, "They're leaving. Server room is intact. Tell Daniel to finish the export." He leaned against this corridor wall and waited, and the building hummed around him. And 14 minutes later, the sound of the elevator opening again was not Derek Calloway, but 2 federal agents in dark jackets with badges on lanyards who came out looking like people who had been moving fast and had arrived where they needed to be. He raised his hands, palms out, visible, old instinct, the gesture of someone who knew exactly how this moment went and wanted it to go cleanly. "Mason Ryder," he said, "I've been in contact with your supervisor. I'm the one who called this in." The lead agent looked at him steadily. "Is the server room intact?" "Yes," Mason said. "Nobody got in." The agent nodded. Her partner was already on the radio. Mason stood in the corridor and watched them move and thought about Derek Calloway in an elevator going down, going somewhere, carrying the weight of what he hadn't been able to do and what was coming after, and about Richard Calloway somewhere in the city not yet knowing that the thing he'd sent his son to prevent had already been prevented. The server room door was still closed. Everything that needed to survive the night was still intact. The arrests happened on a Wednesday. Victoria learned about them the way she'd learned about most things in this investigation. Through a phone call at an inconvenient hour, this time 6:48 in the morning, while she was still in her apartment, coffee in hand, not yet dressed for the building she ran. The call was from Webb, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not relief exactly, but the particular decompression of someone who had been holding a structure together under significant pressure and had just felt the load shift. "They took Richard Calloway at his home at 6 a.m., Webb said. "Derek was picked up at the same time at his apartment. Federal marshals, simultaneous, coordinated. Both in custody without incident. Victoria set her coffee down. The charges, she asked, healthcare fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, falsification of medical records, obstruction of justice. That's the initial filing. The U.S. Attorney's Office indicated this morning that additional charges are under review pending the forensic accounting results, which, given what we found in the vendor records, almost certainly means the fraud count is going to expand significantly. Webb paused. And there's a separate criminal referral being prepared on the 4 patient files with altered documentation. That one's going to a different unit. It moves slower, but it's moving. The patient deaths, Victoria said. Yes. She stood at her kitchen window and looked at the city coming awake in the early morning light. The particular ordinary aliveness of a place that didn't know what had just happened inside one of its hospitals, and felt a complicated thing that she couldn't cleanly name. It was not triumph. It was something more like the exhausted recognition that a long and ugly process had reached a particular milestone, and that there were more miles ahead, and that the people who'd been hurt by what she'd uncovered were still hurt and would remain so regardless of whatever happened in a courtroom. Who knows? She asked. As of right now, federal law enforcement, our team, the attorneys, the press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office is scheduled for 9 a.m. Webb's voice was careful. You're going to want to be at the hospital before that goes out. Your staff is going to hear it in the public news cycle, and they're going to need to hear from you. I know, she said. Webb, thank you for all of it. A pause. Get some sleep after this is over, he said. You look tired, even through the phone. She was at the hospital by 7:20. Daniel met her at the elevator with a look on his face that told her he already knew. He'd been monitoring the federal docket since 4 a.m., which she later learned was something he'd been doing every night for the past week. He handed her a coffee and fell into step beside her without being asked. The board is going to convene an emergency session, he said. Probably this afternoon, once the press release hits. 3 of the 7 remaining members are Callaway appointments. They're going to be in damage control mode. I know. She was already thinking through it. The specific board members, their relationship to the Callaway network, who among them had known what and who had simply benefited from not asking questions. Get me a call with Patricia Osei before 10, and I want the external PR firm on standby from 9 o'clock. Not to spin this, just to manage the volume. Already sent them a heads up last night, Daniel said. She glanced at him. You were confident this was happening today. The federal docket had a scheduling entry that was consistent with an arrest warrant being executed, he said. I wasn't certain, but I wanted to be ready. She thought about the past 6 weeks, the way he'd moved through this entire situation, placing the board filing on her desk, pulling the server logs at midnight, monitoring documents through the night, all of it done without being asked, without making it about himself, without ever once suggesting that he expected anything in return. Daniel, she said. He looked at her. After this is over, we're going to have a serious conversation about your title and your compensation. He almost smiled. Almost. Yes, ma'am, he said. See, at 9:03 a.m., the U.S. Attorney's press release went live. By 9:15, Victoria's phone had received 47 incoming calls, none of which she answered. By 9:30, she was standing in the hospital's main conference room in front of 63 staff members who had been pulled from non-critical duties for an all-hands, and she was telling them the truth, not all of it, not the parts that were still under federal seal, not the names of the specific patients whose records had been altered, but the essential shape of it, delivered plainly and without the institutional language that organizations used when they wanted to acknowledge something without fully saying it. This facility was used to commit crimes, she said, significant financial crimes and falsification of medical records over a period of years. The people responsible have been arrested and will face federal prosecution. I want you to hear that from me directly, and I want to answer as many of your questions as I can. The room was very quiet. A resident physician near the back raised her hand. Were patient deaths involved? There are cases under review, Victoria said. I can't speak to the specifics while the investigation is ongoing. What I can tell you is that every case flagged for review will be reviewed completely, and the results will be reported publicly. How long did you know? Someone else asked. A nurse, Middle-aged, her face carrying the specific expression of someone who had worked hard in this building for years and was now doing the math on what had been happening around her. I began identifying anomalies approximately 4 months ago, Victoria said. Before that, I had concerns without sufficient evidence to act on them formally. I moved as fast as I could once the evidence was in hand. She paused. I know that answer doesn't feel like enough. I understand that. I'm not going to pretend the timeline is comfortable because it isn't. The nurse nodded slowly, not forgiving exactly, but acknowledging. The questions went on for 40 minutes. Some were practical. What happened to board governance? What happened to pending contracts? What happened to the Callaway Health Partners financial structure that underpinned several departments' operating budgets? Some were emotional. A senior nurse who had worked the overnight care unit for 16 years and was visibly shaken. A facilities manager who had suspected something in the supply chain for 2 years and had filed a report that had been closed without finding. That last one hit Victoria like a physical thing. Your report is going to be re-examined, she told him. If you documented it, it matters. Tell Daniel before you leave today. After the room emptied, she stood at the conference table for a moment in the silence, and she let herself feel the weight of it, the years of it, the people inside it, the specific human cost of a system that had protected itself by making everyone inside it complicit in their own silence. Then she straightened and went back to work. The emergency board session was at 2 p.m. 3 of the 7 remaining board members, the Callaway appointments, arrived looking like men who had spoken to lawyers within the past 2 hours, which they probably had. The other 4 were a mixture of expressions ranging from controlled concern to something closer to genuine shock, the latter being the ones Victoria had always thought were decent people who had simply failed to ask the questions that might have cost them their comfort. She presented the factual record first, what the federal investigation had found, what charges had been filed, what the exposure to the institution was in terms of regulatory liability and civil suits that would likely follow. She did it without editorializing. The numbers were sufficient. When she finished, a board member named Harold Finch, one of the 4 non-Callaway members, a retired hospital administrator who had been on the board for 7 years, said, Victoria, I want to ask you directly, did you know about any of this when you took this position? No, she said. I inherited concerns that the previous administration had apparently decided not to pursue. I pursued them, and the Callaway appointments on this board. Do you have any evidence that they had knowledge of the fraud? That question is appropriately within the scope of the federal investigation, not my determination, she said. I'd recommend that anyone with potential exposure speak to independent counsel immediately. 2 of the 3 Callaway board members exchanged a look. The board needs to appoint an independent oversight committee effective immediately, Victoria continued. External legal counsel, independent financial auditor, and a patient safety review panel to examine the flagged cases. That committee should report directly to the board, not to my office, and its findings should be publicly disclosed. She paused. I'll cooperate with everything they need. I'll also be transparent about my own role in the investigation, what I knew, when I knew it, and what I did. If there are questions about my conduct, I'd rather they be examined openly than managed privately. Finch looked at her steadily. That's not a posture most executives take. I know, she said. I've been watching what the other posture costs people. She found Mason outside the building at 4:30, sitting on a bench near the main entrance where the landscaping created a narrow pocket of relative quiet away from the parking lot. He was watching Lily, who had come with him today for reasons that hadn't fully been explained to Victoria, but that she suspected had something to do with the fact that Mason didn't entirely trust the situation yet and wanted his daughter close, playing some elaborate game at the edge of the grass that appeared to involve sorting pebbles by color and assigning them ranks. Victoria sat on the bench beside him. She was more tired than she'd felt in years. Not the productive exhaustion of a long, difficult night, but something deeper. The fatigue of sustained high-stakes operation over weeks, the kind that settled into your bones and didn't lift just because the acute phase was over. How did the board go? Mason asked. About as well as it could have, she said. 3 of them are going to lawyer up and probably resign within the week. The other 4 seem genuinely willing to do what needs to be done. She paused. We'll see. He nodded. How's Carol? She asked. Talked to her this morning. She's still at her sister's. Patricia says she has full whistleblower protection in place as of yesterday, and she can come home whenever she's ready. He paused. She's not ready yet. She needs a few more days. That's fair, Victoria said. More than fair. Carol Pfeiffer had kept this secret alone for 7 months in a building full of people who had the power to take everything she'd built from her. And she'd gotten to this point on the strength of one conversation in a parking garage with a man she'd never met. A few days felt like the minimum. Jessica Tran gave her formal statement to the FBI this morning, Mason said. Patricia was there. I heard. Webb told me. Victoria looked out at the parking lot. She's going to need to testify eventually. Probably. She knows that. She's 24 years old. I know. His voice was quiet. She made a hard choice. People do that sometimes. Lily had organized her pebbles into what appeared to be a command structure, with a large gray stone at the center surrounded by progressively smaller ones. She was explaining something to the arrangement in a low, serious voice. What's she doing? Victoria asked. She calls it Stone Council, Mason said. She's been doing it since she was 6. Each stone represents a person, and they vote on things. What kinds of things? Currently, whether it's fair that I've been making her eat vegetables at breakfast. He paused. The vote keeps coming out against me. Victoria laughed. A real laugh, unexpected, the kind that came out of exhaustion and the sudden absurdity of sitting on a bench outside a hospital at the end of the longest 6 weeks of her professional life, talking about a child's stone parliament. It came out of her imperfectly, a little too loud, and she put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Mason watched her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something warm and unguarded that he didn't make any effort to manage. I forget sometimes, she said, when she'd collected herself, that regular life is still happening. It doesn't stop, he said, even when everything else is going. No, she said, it doesn't. They sat in comfortable quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that didn't require filling, and Lily continued to adjudicate the Stone Council, and the afternoon went on around them. The trial was set for 4 months out. In the weeks between the arrests and the trial date, the shape of what had happened inside Callaway Health Partners continued to expand as the forensic accounting team worked through the full records. The final fraud figure, when the federal filing was complete, was $47 million across 7 years and 4 facilities, a number so large that Victoria had to read it 3 times before it settled. Medical supply theft, insurance fraud on deceased patients, inflated vendor contracts routed through shell entities, and in one procurement category, direct falsification of government billing records related to Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements. That last category added federal healthcare fraud charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences. The patient review panel, working through the 11 flagged cases with independent forensic pathologists, ultimately determined that 4 deaths were inconsistent with their documented causes. 2 were referred for homicide investigation. The other 2 remained under medical examiner review, their determinations pending additional analysis that would take months. Victoria read each of these findings in her office alone before they went to the oversight committee, and she sat with each one longer than she probably should have, not because sitting with them changed anything, but because she thought the specific act of not looking away mattered. These were people who had died inside an institution she ran, in a building her grandfather had built with a stated purpose, and they deserved at minimum to not be handled with the efficient administrative distance that institutions use to protect themselves from the full weight of what had happened inside them. She wrote letters to the families, not form letters, specific letters, each one different, each one acknowledging a specific person. She ran them through Patricia Osai's review to make sure they didn't constitute admissions of institutional liability in a way that would complicate the civil suits she knew were coming, and she sent them anyway. 2 families wrote back. The trial itself ran for 19 days. Victoria testified on day 4. She had testified before, regulatory hearings, depositions, board reviews, and she understood the particular performance of testimony, the way you had to translate complex institutional knowledge into plain language for a room full of people who were coming to the material fresh, without the months of context you carried. She had prepared carefully, worked through the specific sequence of events with the federal prosecutors until the timeline was clear in her mind, organized the facts she had access to and the facts she didn't into categories that wouldn't blur under cross-examination. She sat in the witness chair and answered questions for 6 hours across 2 days. The government's questions established the framework, her role, her timeline of discovery, the specific anomalies she'd identified, the steps she'd taken to document and report. She answered these carefully and specifically, without embellishment, keeping her voice level and her language precise. Defense counsel's questions were designed to suggest she had known earlier, acted slower, motivated by personal animosity toward Richard Calloway rather than genuine institutional concern. She answered these the same way, specifically with reference to dates and documented actions, without defensiveness, and without letting her voice carry the irritation she sometimes felt at the particular angle of the questioning. At one point, defense counsel asked her whether her decision to involve a non-employee civilian, Mason Ryder, in what she characterized as an internal investigation was consistent with standard institutional protocol. "No," she said. "Can you explain why you did it then?" She looked at the jury, 12 people who had been listening to 19 days of financial documents and institutional chronology and the specific language of federal fraud prosecution, and she said plainly, "Because the standard institutional protocols were compromised, because every channel that should have caught this problem had been routed around or suppressed, and because I needed someone who was outside the system and outside its reach, who had the specific skills to move through this situation without being visible to the people who were monitoring my movements." She paused. "Mason Ryder is also the person who was present in this hospital the night someone tried to destroy the server records. He's the reason that evidence survived long enough to be in front of you." Defense counsel moved on. When she stepped down from the stand on the second day, she walked out through the courtroom's side door into the corridor and found Mason standing against the wall, hands in his pockets, Lily's drawing of a penguin folded in his jacket pocket because she'd given it to him that morning and told him it was for luck. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, directly, without trying to read ahead to what she needed, just being present in the specific moment they were in. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Okay, I think." She stopped beside him. "Your name came up. I heard from the prosecutor's office it might. Defense counsel tried to make it look like I was reckless, bringing in someone unofficial." "What did you say?" She told him what she'd said. He listened, and something in his face settled into a quiet that was its own kind of response. "Thank you," he said. "I was telling the truth," she said. "I know. That's why I'm thanking you." Ahmad. Carol Pfeiffer testified on day 9. She arrived in a gray suit that looked like it had been bought recently, possibly for this specific occasion, and she sat in the witness chair with the upright composure of someone who had spent weeks building toward this moment by deciding every morning that she was going to hold. She answered the prosecution's questions steadily, her voice consistent, her memory for dates and record numbers precise in the way that people's memories were precise when they'd been living with specific details for months, turning them over and checking them in the small hours. When she described finding the billing records, the specific cold recognition of what she was looking at, the 45 minutes she'd spent in the secure files unit cross-referencing 3 patient charts, the moment she'd understood the scope of it, the courtroom was fully still. Defense counsel's cross-examination tried to characterize her documentation as partial and her interpretation as speculative. She said, in a voice that didn't waver, "I've been a nurse for 22 years. I've worked in medical records administration. I've coded billing. I've reviewed insurance documentation for discharge planning. I know what a fraudulent billing entry looks like. These were fraudulent billing entries." There was nothing theatrical in the way she said it. That was, in the end, what made it land. Webb, testifying on day 11 as a financial crimes expert, walked the jury through the full scope of the vendor fraud and the insurance billing scheme with the methodical precision of someone who had spent months living inside the numbers and understood them completely. He used charts. He used timelines. He explained the Delaware Shell Company structure in terms that non-accountants could follow without simplifying the substance. The jury asked to review his vendor analysis charts during deliberations, which told the prosecution everything they needed to know. Jessica Tran testified on day 14. She was 24 years old, and she sat in the witness chair looking younger than that, and she described the phone calls she'd overheard, the fragments, the word evidence, the specific reference to a name starting with P. with the careful precision of someone who had been coached to stay within the exact boundaries of what she knew. She was cross-examined hard, and she held. When defense counsel suggested that she was motivated by personal animosity toward Derek Calloway following the end of their relationship, she said evenly, "I moved out of our shared apartment because I was afraid of him. I came forward because I heard him planning to destroy evidence. Those are both true." And on day 16, Margaret Calloway took the stand. Richard Calloway's wife was 61 years old and had been, by all external measure, the quiet complement to her husband's public presence. The woman who appeared at fundraisers and medical galas and board dinners and said the right things in the right order and did not, in any visible way, create friction. Victoria had met her twice over the past 3 years at institutional functions and had formed no particular impression of her beyond competent social management. She had clearly been living with a much more complicated internal landscape than her social presentation suggested. Margaret Calloway had contacted the federal prosecutor's office 12 days before trial through her own independent attorney, not the Calloway family counsel, not anyone connected to the defense team, and had offered to testify for the government. The prosecutor had accepted. The courtroom's attention sharpened visibly when she sat down. She testified for 3 hours. She described, in specific and dated detail, the conversations she had been present for over a course of years, conversations between her husband and Thomas Wick, the logistics consultant and shell company signatory, conversations about managing the exposure on specific patient accounts, a specific conversation in 2020 in which her husband had directed a modification to 4 patient files using language that left no ambiguity about the purpose of the modification. She had not spoken at the time. She said this plainly, without asking for understanding. "I did not speak. I told myself there were explanations I wasn't aware of. I know now that I chose to accept that because the alternative required something I wasn't prepared to do. I'm prepared to do it now." She opened her handbag and removed an envelope. "In 2021, I found this in my husband's home office. I copied it before returning it." She handed it to the prosecutor. "It is a memorandum from Richard to Thomas Wick regarding the case in Ward 7 that the government has designated as Patient 4. It contains instructions for what Richard described as outcome management." The prosecutor presented it as evidence. Defense counsel objected on multiple grounds, all of which were overruled. Victoria, sitting in the gallery, watched Richard Calloway's face while his wife spoke. She had expected something dramatic: anger, the theatrical composure of a man accustomed to controlling rooms, some performance of denial. What she saw instead was something smaller and more final. A man watching the last door close, understanding it was closed, going very still. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Victoria spent most of those 2 days at the hospital, not because she couldn't wait at home, but because she needed to be in the building doing what the building required her to do. There were 4 departments she was working to restructure under the new oversight framework. There were 3 civil suits already filed by patient families that her legal team was managing. There was a federal regulatory review of the facility's billing practices that was going to require a complete systems audit. There was, in other words, a great deal of work to be done, and waiting was not a posture she was well suited to. On the second afternoon, Mason brought Lily to the hospital for her monthly pulmonology follow-up. The asthma was managed now, controlled, the crisis of the ER visit months behind them, and afterward they found Victoria in her office. Lily stood in the doorway with the frank appraisal of a child who had formed an opinion of this room and was updating it. "You have a lot of papers," she said. "I do," Victoria agreed. "My dad has a lot of papers too. He puts them in folders." "That's probably smarter than what I do." Lily considered the office. "Do you live here?" "It feels like that sometimes. My dad said you're working very hard on something important." "He's right." Lily looked at her father briefly, the particular look of a child verifying that an adult conversation is proceeding along lines she approves of, and then back at Victoria. "He works hard too," she said, "on important things." She paused. "You should come to dinner sometime." Mason's expression did not change. He had, Victoria had learned, an extraordinary capacity for maintaining composure when Lily said things that were designed, consciously or not, to produce reactions from the adults around her. "Lily," he said. "I'm just saying," Lily said. Victoria looked at Mason. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had been ambushed by an 8-year-old and was choosing to accept it with dignity. "I'd like that," Victoria said. To Lily, not to Mason. To the source of the invitation, which she thought was the correct protocol. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to examine the window. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Victoria was in a department meeting when her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Osei that contained one sentence: guilty on all counts, both defendants. She sat in the meeting for another 4 minutes, finishing the sentence she'd been in the middle of when the message arrived, and then she said, "I'm sorry, I need to step out," and walked to her office and closed the door. She called Mason. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "Guilty," she said. "All of it." A pause. "Both of them. Both of them." She heard him exhale. A long, controlled breath, the kind that came from the release of something that had been held for a long time. "Carol knows?" he asked. "Patricia is calling her now." "Webb?" "He sent me a text 11 seconds before you answered. He just said, 'Good.'" "That sounds like Webb," Mason said. Victoria stood at her office window. The city outside was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, proceeding along its own enormous logic. And somewhere in a federal courthouse 14 blocks away, 2 men were sitting with the weight of a verdict that would take everything they'd built and built on and used and protected at the cost of other people's lives. And it would not give back what had been lost. And it would not repair everything that had been broken. And it was still the most important thing that had happened in this building in 20 years. "Mason," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you." She said it simply, without trying to encompass everything the 2 words were meant to carry. For stepping out of that alcove, for the corridor at the hospital the first night, for all of it. A pause. "You would have gotten there without me," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but I wouldn't have gotten there in time." He didn't argue with that. Outside her office window, the city moved on, and the afternoon light was coming in at a particular angle that made the glass buildings across the street look briefly and improbably beautiful. And she stood in it for a moment before the next thing started. The sentencing was scheduled for 8 weeks out. Richard Calloway received 23 years. Derek received 11. Neither sentence felt adequate to the families who had lost people in those wards. Victoria understood that, and she did not expect them to feel otherwise. She attended the sentencing in the gallery, and she watched the families, not the defendants, because the defendants' faces were the end of something, and the families' faces were the beginning of something else, the longer, harder, less visible work of going on. After the courtroom cleared, she found Carol Pfeiffer in the corridor outside. Carol looked different than she had in the hospital parking garage 7 weeks ago. Not lighter, exactly. The weight of what she'd done and what had happened had not simply dissolved, but different in the way that people looked when they had done a hard thing and were on the other side of it, carrying it differently than they had before. "How are you?" Victoria asked. "I don't know yet," Carol said. It was the honest answer. "Ask me in 6 months." "I will," Victoria said. Carol nodded. She looked down the courthouse corridor, people moving in both directions, the ordinary machinery of a legal building going on around them. Then she looked back at Victoria. "He said to ask you something," she said. "Who did?" "Mason. He texted me this morning." Carol almost smiled, not quite, but adjacent. "He said to ask you if you'd made up your mind about dinner." Victoria looked at her for a moment. Then she did smile, fully, without managing it. "Tell him yes," she said. Part 2 lưu ý. Viết 5.000 đến 5.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình, viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chi dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more. You've sent the part 2 instruction again. Looks like this may have been a copy-paste slip. You've already got a full part 2 written and part 4 is complete. Did you mean to send part 5? That would be the final section, the resolution, transformation, and the quiet ending between Victoria Mason and Lily, plus Sophie Aldrich's future. Just confirm and I'll write it right away. Dinner happened on a Saturday. It was not a special Saturday, no anniversary of anything, no occasion attached to it, which was exactly the kind of Saturday Victoria had the least experience with. Her life for the past decade had been organized around occasions, board meetings, regulatory deadlines, quarterly reviews, crises both predictable and not. The idea of a Saturday that existed simply as a Saturday, with no function beyond itself, was something she understood in theory and practiced badly. Mason's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building 12 minutes from the hospital, which she suspected was not an accident. It was not a large apartment. It had the organized practicality of a space managed by someone who had learned to live efficiently and had applied that habit to civilian life. Furniture that was solid and unpretentious, a kitchen that showed evidence of actual use, books stacked on shelves in a way that suggested they were read rather than displayed. Lily's presence was distributed throughout in the specific way that children colonized shared spaces. Drawings taped to the refrigerator, a pair of purple rain boots by the front door, a collection of small rocks arranged on the windowsill in what Victoria recognized, after a moment, as a stone council in session. "You can sit anywhere," Mason said from the kitchen. "Lily is finishing something. She'll be out in approximately never, based on current trajectory." "I heard that," Lily said from behind a closed door. "I know," Mason said. Victoria sat at the kitchen table and watched him cook, which he did the way he did most things. Without theater, methodically, with the specific, focused attention of someone who treated the task in front of him as worth doing properly. He was making pasta with a sauce that smelled like it had been going for a while, and he was also simultaneously managing what appeared to be a very strong-willed disagreement with the garlic bread situation, which kept burning at the edges. "You don't have to watch," he said, without turning around. "I'm not watching critically," she said. "I'm watching because I haven't seen anyone cook in my kitchen in about 2 years. This is my kitchen. I know. The point stands." He glanced back at her briefly. There was something in the way he looked at her sometimes, not frequently, and never for long, that was different from the way he looked at problems or situations or information. She had been aware of it for a while, and had been doing the reasonable thing, which was not examining it too closely in the middle of everything else. Lily emerged from her room at the precise moment the pasta was ready, which suggested she had been monitoring the cooking timeline from behind the door. "I helped pick the sauce," she informed Victoria, climbing into her chair. "Did you?" "He wanted to make the plain one. I said we should make the one with the tomatoes and the stuff in it." "The stuff," Mason said. "Basil, garlic, the red pepper flakes you made me add, and then refused to eat because it was too spicy." "I didn't refuse," Lily said with great dignity. "I adapted." Victoria looked at this child, 8 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with the complete self-possession of someone who had figured out that the world was manageable if you approached it directly, and felt something settle quietly in her chest. Not sentimentality, something more honest than that, something closer to recognition. They ate and they talked, not about the case, not about the trial or the sentencing or the ongoing civil suits or any of the things that had consumed the past months. Mason asked Victoria about her grandfather, who had built the hospital, and she found herself telling him things she rarely told anyone. The specific texture of her childhood spent in the building's corridors, the way her grandfather had talked about medicine as an obligation rather than a profession, the complicated inheritance of loving something that had been used badly. She talked more than she usually did, and noticed it without stopping. Lily asked her what her favorite animal was, which led to a 10-minute discussion of the relative merits of various species that Mason participated in with the same serious attention he gave everything, and which ended with Lily pronouncing that Victoria's answer, an octopus, for reasons relating to intelligence and adaptability, was unusual but acceptable. After dinner, while Mason was managing the dishes, and Lily was showing Victoria the current Stone Council configuration on the windowsill, a complex political structure involving 3 factions and an ongoing territorial dispute between what Lily identified as the Mountain Stones and the River Stones. Victoria stood at the window and looked out at the evening city and thought about something that had been sitting at the back of her mind for weeks. Not about the case, about what came after it. What came after it turned out to be considerably more complicated than the trial. The institutional work was in some ways harder than the investigation had been. The investigation had a shape, a beginning, a middle, a forward direction, the particular momentum of uncovering something that wanted to stay hidden. The rebuilding had no such shape. It was incremental and uneven and full of the specific frustrations of trying to repair damage in a system that was still functioning, still seeing patients, still requiring every ordinary operational decision while simultaneously attempting to become something different than what it had been. The federal regulatory review took 4 months. It examined billing practices across all departments, patient safety protocols in the 2 wards with flagged outcome data, and the procurement and vendor management systems that the fraud had moved through. The reviewers were thorough and occasionally difficult and found 11 additional compliance issues unrelated to the Callaway fraud. Smaller problems, the kind of administrative drift that happen in large institutions over time, none of them criminal, all of them fixable. Victoria fixed them. The Independent Oversight Committee produced its report in month 3. It was 87 pages and recommended 22 specific structural changes to governance, financial oversight, and patient safety reporting. Victoria implemented all 22. 4 of them required board approval, and getting board approval required rebuilding enough trust with the reconstituted board. 3 of the Callaway appointees had resigned, replaced by new members selected through an external nomination process, that they were willing to move on significant structural changes quickly rather than slowly. This took more political capital than she'd expected and more patience than she naturally had. The civil suits filed by the families of the 4 patients whose deaths had been reviewed were settled over a period of 6 months. The terms were confidential, which Victoria had argued against and lost. The institution's legal team had held firm on confidentiality as the price of settlements that the families could actually use, rather than protracted litigation that might take years and deliver uncertain outcomes. She had accepted this because the family's attorneys had accepted it. It still sat uncomfortably with her. The 2 homicide investigations, the cases referred from the patient review panel, moved through the criminal system at the slow, thorough pace of homicide investigations that relied on medical forensic evidence and altered records and institutional testimony. Both cases were pending as of the end of the year. Victoria checked on them regularly. She expected they would not resolve quickly. She expected to be checking on them for a long time. None of this was clean. None of it resolved in the satisfying, complete way that justified conclusions were supposed to resolve in. It was the grinding, imperfect, necessary work of an institution attempting to earn back something it had forfeited through years of deliberate wrongdoing, and it happened in increments too small to feel like progress on any given day, visible only when you looked back over months. She looked back regularly. She made herself do it deliberately, reviewing not just the open items but the closed ones, the fixed things, the actual improvements. Because she had learned over the past year that the people who sustained this kind of work were the ones who kept honest track of both what remained and what had been done. The ones who only counted what remained burned out. The ones who only counted what had been done stopped seeing clearly. She was trying to do neither. Mason started his federal position in January. The role was with a unit that investigated institutional fraud in healthcare settings, a relatively new unit, modestly staffed, operating with the specific combination of limited resources and significant scope that characterized federal programs that had been important enough to create, but not yet important enough to fund properly. He had been recruited through Webb's FBI contact, who had watched him operate during the Callaway investigation and made a specific recommendation to her supervisor. He had spent 2 weeks thinking about whether to take it. He told Victoria about the offer on a Tuesday evening, sitting on a bench outside the hospital. They had developed a habit of this, the bench conversations, a transition space between the building and the rest of the day. It would mean travel, he said, not constantly but regularly, weeks at a time sometimes. What does Lily think? I haven't told her yet. I wanted to think it through first. Victoria looked at him. You've already decided. He was quiet for a moment. I think so, he said. Yeah. Then tell me why you're still thinking. He turned the pen in his fingers, the habit she'd long since catalogued. Because the last time I took a job that meant being away from her regularly, her mother was still alive. She had someone. He paused. Now it's just me. Victoria sat with that. She did not offer the reflexive reassurance. She'll be fine. You'll manage. Lots of parents do this. Because Mason didn't need reassurance, and she'd long since learned that offering it when it wasn't warranted was its own kind of dismissal. You're good at this, she said instead. The work you did on this case, the way you moved through it, the way you handled Carol, the night in the server corridor, that's not just transferable skill. That's a specific capability that matters for people who are inside these systems and can't get out of them on their own. She paused. That matters. I know it matters, he said. That's not the question. I know, she said. The question is whether Lily losing some of your time is a cost she should pay for other people to benefit. Yes. And you can't answer that from outside the conversation with her. He looked at her. No, he said. I can't. He told Lily on Wednesday. He sat her down after dinner with the particular seriousness that she recognized as meaning this was a real conversation and not a negotiating situation. And he explained what the job was. Helping find people who hurt other people by lying about money in hospitals, which was how he translated federal healthcare fraud investigation for an 8-year-old, and what it would require, and what it would mean for how often he was home. Lily listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was unusual. When he finished, she was quiet for about 10 seconds. Would you be helping people like Victoria help those people? She asked. Yes, he said. Similar. She thought about it. Would you still come to my school things? I would do everything I possibly could to come to your school things. That's not a yes. No, he said. It's not. I'd miss some of them. I'd try not to, but I'd miss some. Another silence. Okay, she said finally. Okay. The Riverstones voted, she said, and went to update the Stone Council. Mason sat at the kitchen table for a moment after she left. And when he looked up, Victoria, who had been at the kitchen counter pretending to be very interested in the glass of water she was holding, found him with an expression that was too many things at once to name cleanly. Love and uncertainty and the specific weight of raising a person alone and not always knowing if you were doing it right. She's going to be okay, Victoria said. I know, he said. Then, how do you know? Because she has you, Victoria said. And because she knows how to adapt. Carol Pfeiffer went back to work in February. Not at Hale Medical Center. She had made that decision herself, without pressure from anyone, during the months she'd spent at her sister's place in Columbus, turning the question over until she arrived at an answer that felt honest. She took a position at a smaller regional hospital 40 minutes from the city, in a ward that was, by any institutional metric, considerably less fraught than the one she'd left. She called Victoria to tell her. I want to keep doing the work, Carol said. I just can't do it there. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I'm not sure yet. That's the right answer, Victoria said. I wanted to thank you, Carol said, for calling me that night, telling me to go to my sister's. Mason told me to do that. I know, Carol said. I thanked him too. A pause. You two are good together. We're colleagues, Victoria said. Carol made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite the opposite. After they hung up, Victoria sat at her desk and thought about that. The specific plainness of you two are good together. The way Carol had said it with the directness of someone who had recently made a series of very difficult, honest decisions and had lost patience for indirection in other areas. She thought about Mason and the bench conversations and the Saturday dinners that had become a regular thing without being formally declared a regular thing, and the specific quality of his attention, The way he listened, the way he stayed in a room, the way he was exactly where he said he would be and never anywhere else. She thought about what it cost to let people in and what it cost not to. She was 30 years old. She had run a company through a crisis that would have finished most institutions. She had navigated a federal investigation, a board restructuring, a regulatory review, and a 19-day trial without losing either the institution or herself. She had done these things, in large part, because she had been unwilling to manage them alone once she understood she didn't have to. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not the case. Not the verdict. Not the $47 million, or the 2 men in federal prison, or the 11 compliance issues fixed, or the 22 structural changes implemented. The thing she kept returning to was simpler than all of that. She had asked for help, and the help had come. Not from a system, not from a process. From a specific person who had been standing in a hallway at 1 a.m. because his daughter had an asthma attack, and who had made a decision that most people in that building had declined to make, and whose willingness to stand in the gap between what was happening and what should happen had changed the outcome of everything that followed. She had spent her entire adult life operating on the assumption that self-sufficiency was the most reliable protection, that asking for help was a vulnerability to be managed, that the fewer people you let inside the walls of what you were trying to do, the fewer ways there were for things to go wrong. She was not certain she'd been entirely wrong about that. Institutions were full of people who used proximity to bring things down rather than hold them up, and her instinct for self-protection had not been baseless, but she had also been wrong in ways that mattered. The system that had protected Richard Calloway for 7 years had depended, in part, on the isolation of the people who might have stopped him. It had worked because everyone who saw something had also seen that they were alone in seeing it, and aloneness was a kind of arithmetic that usually came out on the side of silence. What had broken it open was not her determination. She'd had determination for months and it hadn't been sufficient, but the accumulation of people who had decided, one after another, that they were not going to be alone in this. Carol, Webb, Daniel, Jessica, Margaret Calloway in her gray suit with her envelope, Mason in a corridor at 2 a.m. with nothing but presence and plain speech and 12 years of knowing when to move. You didn't fix these things by being good enough alone. You fixed them by being willing to be seen by the right people and trusting them to stand in the places you couldn't reach. She was still learning how to do that. She expected she would be learning it for a long time. Sophie Aldrich was discharged from Hale Medical Center on a Tuesday morning in early spring, 7 days after she'd been brought in. Victoria was there when she left, not in any official capacity. Sophie was not her patient. The discharge was managed by Priya and the ward team, and there was no institutional reason for the CEO to be standing near the main entrance when a 15-year-old in a borrowed sweatshirt walked out into the March air with her parents on either side of her, moving carefully but moving. Victoria was there because she had wanted to be, and she had learned recently to take that kind of wanting seriously. Sophie looked smaller in daylight than she had in the trauma bay, smaller and more ordinary, a teenage girl with a backpack and a slight hitch in her breathing that the doctor said would resolve over the next few weeks. Her mother was carrying a plastic bag of discharge paperwork, and her father had the specific look of a man who had been frightened badly enough that the fear had permanently changed the texture of ordinary relief. They stopped near the entrance, and Sophie looked up at the building, looked up at it the way people looked at places where something significant had happened to them. And Victoria, standing 20 feet away, watched her do it. Sophie's mother noticed Victoria first and said something to her daughter, and Sophie looked over. She didn't know who Victoria was specifically. They hadn't met. Victoria had been on the administrative side of everything, not the clinical side. But there was a moment of recognition nonetheless, the particular recognition of someone who had been told about the night and was now placing a face inside that story. Sophie walked over to her. "You were here that night," she said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Yes," Victoria said. Sophie looked at her directly, with the frank gaze of a 15-year-old who had recently been in a situation that required her to understand very quickly what was real. "My mom told me what happened, that you stayed." She paused. "Thank you." Victoria looked at this girl, 15 years old, alive, standing in March sunlight, and thought about the phone call at 11:47 p.m., and the 4 minutes in the hallway and the 19 hours of wakefulness, and what it meant that she was standing here on a Tuesday morning, watching this child walk out of a building under her own power. "Take care of yourself," Victoria said. It came out plainly, without ceremony. "Go do whatever you're supposed to do." Sophie almost smiled. "I'm going back to school," she said. "I'm going to be a doctor." She said it the way teenagers said things they meant entirely, not as aspiration hedged by uncertainty, but as plan, as direction, as the most natural next sentence. She had been inside the machine of emergency medicine at its most urgent, and it had not frightened her away from it. It had apparently done the opposite. Victoria watched her walk back to her parents and through the main doors and into the ordinary morning, and she stood there for a moment after they were gone, in the particular stillness that followed certain moments. Then she went back to work. There was a Saturday afternoon in April, about 6 weeks after the sentencing, when nothing specific was happening. Victoria was at Mason's apartment again. The Saturday dinners had solidified into a reliable weekly rhythm, the kind that happens when no one formally proposes it and everyone simply keeps showing up. And Lily was at a friend's birthday party until 5, which meant there were 2 hours of the afternoon that had no particular agenda attached to them, a condition that Victoria still found faintly disorienting. Mason was on the couch reading. Victoria was at the kitchen table with her laptop, nominally working on the revised version of the patient safety reporting protocol that the Oversight Committee had recommended, actually spending a significant portion of her attention on the fact that the afternoon was quiet and the apartment smelled like the coffee Mason had made an hour ago, and the March light was coming through the window at a good angle. After a while, Mason said, without looking up from his book, "You're not actually working." "I'm thinking about working," she said. "How's that going?" Slowly. He turned a page. She looked at him. The specific, easy way he occupied a couch, the deliberate quality of his stillness that was so different from the stillness of someone who was waiting for something. He was not waiting for anything. He was simply there, in the afternoon, reading, with the complete presence of a person who had learned the hard way that the present was worth occupying fully. She thought about what Carol had said. "You two are good together." She thought about the way he had asked, in a hospital corridor 10 months ago, "Are you safe?" Not as a pleasantry, not as an institutional formality, but as a direct and serious question from someone who intended to do something about the answer. She thought about Lily's stone counsel and the purple penguin water bottle and the particular sentence she gets it from her mother, which he had said once and never repeated, and which had told her more about him than 3 months of conversation. "Mason," she said. He looked up. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because I'm better at plain than I am at the other way." He set his book down. He gave her his full attention, which when it happened was a specific and complete thing. "I have not been good at this," she said. "At letting things develop the way they're developing. I have a long history of managing things before they become things, because managed distance is easier than the alternative." She paused. "I'm aware I've been doing that with you, and I don't want to do it anymore." He looked at her steadily. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "Yes." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, looking at her directly. "I've been waiting for you to be ready to say that. I didn't want to push it. You could have said something. You needed to get there yourself," he said. "And you did." She looked at him. "How long have you been waiting?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything seriously. "Since the parking lot bench," he said, "when you laughed." She remembered the laugh, the imperfect, too loud laugh about Lily's stone council vote on vegetables, the one that had surprised her out of herself. She had not realized he'd been measuring from that moment. "That's a specific answer," she said. "It was a specific moment," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed to be said right then. And they were both people who understood the value of not filling a silence that was already saying something. This was the thing about what had grown between them. It had not grown smoothly or quickly or without complication. It had grown the way things grew between two people who had both been broken by something and had rebuilt themselves into versions that worked but carried the evidence of the repair. It was not the frictionless ease of people who had found each other before the hard things happened. It was something more durable than that, and more honest. Two people who had seen each other in operational conditions, under pressure, in crisis, at 2 in the morning in a hospital corridor, and had not been disappointed by what they saw. That was not nothing. In Victoria's experience, it was actually quite rare. Yet, she thought sometimes about the shape of what had happened. Not the case, not the trial, but the larger shape underneath it. The thing it had revealed about how systems worked and why they failed and what it actually took to change them. The thing she kept returning to was this. The Callaway operation had not survived for 7 years because Richard Callaway was exceptionally clever or exceptionally powerful, though he was both of those things. It had survived because it had correctly identified the specific thing that made good people stay quiet, which was not fear of the powerful man at the top. It was fear of being alone in the fight against him. You could be brave. You could know what you knew. You could have evidence. And if you looked around and saw no one else willing to stand with you, the most likely outcome was that you put the evidence in a safe place and got up the next morning and went to work and told yourself that someone with more protection, more resources, more insulation from consequences would eventually do what you couldn't afford to do. Carol Pfeiffer had done this for 7 months. Victoria herself had done it for longer than she was entirely comfortable admitting. The whole architecture of institutional corruption depended on this, on the reliable human calculation that going alone against power was a losing proposition. It was a reasonable calculation. It was usually correct. The people who made it were not cowards. They were rational actors in systems specifically designed to make courage expensive. What broke it, every time it broke, was not a single exceptional person willing to sacrifice everything. That story existed, and it was real, and it was important, but it was also incomplete. What actually broke it was the moment when one person discovered they were not alone. When the calculation changed from me against the system to us against the system, and the arithmetic shifted. Mason had stepped out of an alcove in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning because he was the kind of person who stepped out of alcoves. Carol had sent photographs to her sister in Columbus because someone told her plainly what staying silent was actually costing. Jessica Tran had called a number she'd been given by a stranger because she had watched a man raise his hand in a hospital hallway and recognized the pattern. Daniel had pulled server logs at midnight because he'd spent months watching his boss fight something that deserved to be fought. Margaret Callaway had walked into a federal courthouse with an envelope because, at 61 years old, she had finally decided that the version of safety she'd been maintaining was not actually safety. None of them were exceptional. None of them had done something that required unusual courage in isolation. Each of them had done one specific thing at one specific moment when the person who needed them to do it had made it possible. That was the lesson Victoria had not expected to learn from the hardest year of her professional life. Not that institutions could be fixed by determined individuals. She'd believed that coming in, and it was only partially true. The real lesson was simpler and harder. You could not fix an institution from inside it, alone. You needed to be willing to be seen, willing to ask, willing to trust that the people who showed up when you did were worth trusting. She had been willing to be seen in that corridor at 1 in the morning when she had nothing left to manage with. A man she'd never met had stepped out of the background and changed the outcome of everything that followed. The willingness to be seen was the first act. Everything else was built on it. Lily came home from the birthday party at 5:15 with a party favor bag and blue frosting on her jacket collar and the particular wired energy of a child who had eaten cake and played high-intensity games for 3 hours. She stopped in the doorway of the apartment and assessed the situation. Victoria at the kitchen table, Mason on the couch, the quiet of the afternoon, with the rapid social intelligence of a person who had grown up reading adults. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked Victoria. "If that's okay." "I'm asking because it is okay," Lily said. "That's why I asked." "Then yes," Victoria said. Lily dropped her party bag on the floor. Mason said her name in the particular tone that meant, "Pick that up," and she picked it up without argument, and went to the windowsill to check on the Stone Council. "The River Stones won the territorial dispute," she announced. "How?" Mason asked. "Diplomatic agreement. The Mountain Stones got the north side, and the River Stones got access to the window light." She repositioned 2 stones with great deliberateness. "It's called a compromise." "I know what a compromise is," Mason said. "I was explaining it for Victoria." But Victoria looked at this child, and at this man, and at the apartment that had become familiar to her over months in the way that spaces became familiar when you spent enough time in them. the specific arrangement of a life built carefully out of the materials available. And she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. Not resolution exactly, not the clean ending of a difficult chapter. It was messier than that and more honest. There were still civil suits. There were still homicide investigations moving slowly through their process. There was still a hospital that needed rebuilding every day, incrementally, without the satisfaction of a single moment when it was finished. There was still Mason's new job and the travel it required and the weeks when he wouldn't be home, and the question of how you built something real with someone whose work took them away from you regularly. There was still Lily, who was 8 and growing, and had already lost one person and lived with the particular knowledge of a child who understood that loss was a real and possible thing. None of it was resolved. All of it was ongoing. But the apartment was warm and the coffee had been good, and the afternoon had been the kind of afternoon that didn't require a reason. And Mason was looking at her from the couch with that specific look, and Lily was holding up a pebble to the window light and explaining its rank in the Stone Council hierarchy. And Victoria Hale, who had spent the better part of her adult life believing that managed distance was the most reliable protection, sat at a kitchen table on a Saturday in April and understood, with the particular clarity of something finally seen plainly, that it was not. The most reliable protection was not distance. It was the people willing to stand in the corridor with you when everything else was at risk, and the courage to let them. She had learned this the hard way, which was, in her experience, the only way it ever fully landed. Outside the window, the April evening was doing what April evenings did. The particular light of a season turning, the specific quality of air that meant something was changing from what it had been into something it was going to be. The ordinary and persistent fact of the world moving forward at its own pace, indifferent to the dramas playing out inside its buildings, carrying everyone along regardless. Lily set the pebble back on the windowsill. "It's the ambassador's stone," she said with complete satisfaction. "It goes between the two sides." Mason looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Mason. "Good placement," Mason said. "I know," Lily said. "I've been thinking about it for a week." And the evening went on, and the city went on. And the three of them stayed in the warm and ordinary light of a Saturday that had no occasion attached to it and needed none. Just this, just here, just the quiet accumulation of ordinary moments between people who had come to each other by the hard route and were, for now, exactly where they were supposed to be.